The wind moved through Ironville the way it always did before something broke, low and cold, carrying the smell of iron and pine from the mountains to the east. The great gates of the palace had not been opened for 3 days. No one inside the court spoke about why. They had learned over the years that silence was the safest answer to questions that Cale had not invited anyone to ask. He stood at the window of the war room on the 4th floor, looking down at the training yard where 60 of his best warriors moved through their drills in the gray morning light. They were good. They were precise. They did not know he was watching, and they did not need to. Cale had not built his kingdom on warriors who needed to be watched. He had built it on men and women who moved with the same discipline, whether the king's eyes were on them or not. That was the first thing any new arrival to Ironville learned. The second thing they learned, usually faster, was not to approach the king without being summoned. The war room behind him was full of people who had been summoned. 3 generals, a border advisor, a cartographer who kept unrolling and re-rolling the same edge of his map, and Lord Harwick, the king's steward, who had served Ironville for 22 years and had learned to read the temperature of any room by the angle of Cale's shoulders. Right now Cale's shoulders said, "Speak carefully and finish fast." "The Delving Pack has pushed another 2 miles into the eastern corridor," General Cole said. He was a broad man with a soldier's bluntness, and he delivered his information the way he delivered everything, without decoration. "At their current pace, they will reach the Ashford tributaries within 3 weeks. "They will not reach them," Cale said. He did not turn from the window. "My lord, without reinforcement of the eastern garrison." "I said they will not reach them." The words were quiet. They were always quiet. Cale had never needed volume. Volume was for men who were afraid they would not be heard. "Redirect the 2nd Cavalry Unit from the southern posting. Send word to Commander Aldrich that he has 7 days to establish a visible perimeter at the Greyline Ridge. The Delving Pack is not advancing out of strength. They are advancing because they believe we are occupied elsewhere. Show them we are not." General Cole wrote something. The cartographer stopped rolling his map. Lord Harwick cleared his throat. It was the kind of throat clearing that had a sentence behind it that the person was not quite ready to say aloud. Cale turned from the window. "Harwick." "The ward arrangement, my lord." Harwick kept his eyes at a respectful middle distance which was not quite meeting Cale's gaze and not quite avoiding it. A careful position. "The Aldenmore chieftain has confirmed. His daughter will arrive within the week. She will require a room in the east wing, access to the. Give her whatever rooms are suitable. Assign her a companion from the household staff. I will receive her in formal court on the day of her arrival and not before." Cale moved to the table, looked at the map without touching it. "Is there anything else that requires this room?" There was not. They left. They always left when the tone shifted to that particular flatness, the one that meant the king had already moved on in his mind, and the conversation was now a courtesy he was extending by staying in it. Harwick was the last to go. At the door he paused, not long, just the pause of a man with one more thing, and said, "The Aldenmore girl is said to be somewhat spirited, my lord." Cale did not look up from the map. "Most border pack people are. That is what living on a border does to a person. It will not be a problem." Harwick left. Cale stood alone with the map and the morning light and the sound of 60 warriors moving in the yard below. He had governed Ironville for 9 years. He had inherited it at 23 from a father whose final year had been spent more in the sick room than the throne room, and he had done what the kingdom needed him to do. He had held the eastern border. He had settled the trade disputes that had festered for a decade before him. He had built the garrison network that now meant no Ironville citizen had to live within a day's walk of an undefended border. He had done all of it correctly. He had done all of it thoroughly. And he had done all of it in the particular silence that had settled over him 6 years ago, the silence that was not peace but that worked, most days, as a reasonable substitute. The physicians had in the first year tried to speak to him about grief. He had listened to them the way he listened to everyone, fully, without interruption, and then he had thanked them and made it clear without saying so directly that the conversation was finished. The grief was not something he needed to speak about. The grief was something he carried the way a bridge carries weight. A bridge does not discuss the weight it holds. It simply holds it or it does not. Cale had decided in the first month of that first year that he would hold it. What he had not decided, what no one decides, because it is not the kind of thing a person can choose, was what to do about the beast. Every alpha carried one. It was not metaphor, it was not symbolism. It was the second soul, the primal intelligence that shared a body with the rational mind, the thing that felt what the thinking part of you was too armored to feel. In most alphas, it ran alongside the conscious self like a second current in the same river, present, separate, occasionally inconvenient, deeply necessary. In Kale, 6 years ago, the beast had gone silent. Not disappeared. He could still feel it, the way you can feel the absence of warmth in a room where a fire used to burn. It was there, it breathed. But it did not speak, did not guide, did not press against the inside of his chest the way it once had. It sat somewhere very deep and very still and made no demands at all. His generals had theories about this which they did not share with him. His physician had concerns, which he expressed in careful language during yearly health assessments. Lord Harwick had said nothing, which was the most eloquent response of all. What Kale knew was this: the silence had made him a better king, technically. Without the beast pushing at him, pulling at him, reacting to things before he had time to think, he was cleaner in his decision-making, more precise. He did not act from impulse. He did not overreach. He did not do the thing that even the strongest alphas sometimes did, the thing where the beast and the man wanted different things, and the war between them came out sideways, in bad decisions made for reasons the king couldn't articulate afterward. He was steady, he was consistent, he was predictable in the way that powerful things need to be predictable, so that the people depending on them can plan. He stood at the window for a while longer after the war room emptied. 60 warriors in the yard below, a kingdom at the borders of 3 territories holding its ground, a name carved into a memorial wall in the eastern corridor of the palace, the only name on that wall with no epitaph beneath it, because Kale had never been able to decide what to put there. Because everything he thought of was either too large or too small, and neither was bearable. He turned away from the window. The day had 17 more hours in it, and every one of them had already been allocated. The Palace of Ironville had been built over 4 generations, each king adding something and taking nothing away, so that the result was a place that made complete sense from the inside and no sense at all from the outside. The western wing was the oldest, its walls 3 feet thick and its corridors lit by narrow windows that had been sized for archers, not light. The eastern wing was the newest, built by Kale's grandfather with wider halls and larger rooms because his grandfather had believed that space was a form of power and that visitors should feel small in it. The throne room was in the center, which had not been planned but had turned out to be appropriate. On the day that the ward from Aldenmore was expected, the palace's 300 residents arranged themselves in the configurations they always took on days when something significant was about to happen. The kitchen staff moved faster and louder. The household guards stood a fraction straighter at their posts. The court ladies and lesser lords found reasons to be in corridors near the throne room, adjusting their schedules with the casual precision of people pretending they had not adjusted their schedules. Lord Harwick moved through all of this like a man who had seen it many times, which he had. He organized the formal receiving line. He confirmed the East Wing rooms were prepared. He spoke to the physician about the ward's travel requirements, which had been listed in the advance letter from Aldenmore as, "No particular requirements, she travels well." This was the first sign that the girl from Aldenmore was not going to be what anyone expected. Most political wards came with long lists. Dietary preferences, sleeping schedules, specific social protocols their home pack observed that the host court was expected to respect. The longer the list, the more clearly it communicated the family's anxiety about their child being away from home. The shorter the list, the more it communicated, though it was harder to say exactly what. Harwick had filed the note and made no comment about it, but he had thought about it. The caravan arrived in the early afternoon. It was small, 2 carriages, 6 mounted escorts, and a travel chest that sat in the back of the second carriage, and was, by its size, either very efficiently packed or very nearly empty. The escorts wore Aldenmore colors but no formal armor. They looked like people who had traveled a long distance at a practical pace, which was not how political delegations usually arrived at the seat of an alpha king. Harwick stood at the base of the palace steps and watched the first carriage door open. A young woman climbed out. She did not wait for the footman to assist her. She was already on the ground by the time he reached the door, and she looked at the steps going up to the palace entrance the way someone looks at a set of stairs they are calculating rather than impressed by. She was not what Harwick had pictured when he had read the word spirited in the chieftain's letter. He had pictured something louder, something with more performance to it. The girl in front of him was not loud. She was simply very present, She had dark hair and a straight posture and eyes that moved across the courtyard with the calm, assessing speed of someone taking inventory. Her eyes stopped on Harwick. "You are the steward," she said. It was not a question. "Lord Harwick, yes. On behalf of King Cale and the House of Ironville, welcome to." "How many people live here?" Harwick paused. "In the palace complex, approximately 300. In the city of Ironville, closer to 40,000. "And the formal court presentation is today?" "This evening, yes. We have prepared rooms in the East Wing where you may rest, and—" "I would rather see the palace first. Is there someone who can show me around?" She looked past him at the palace face. "Or a map would work." Harwick took a breath. He had managed 17 formal wards in 22 years of service. He had never been interrupted quite this specifically. "Your name, if I may, for the court record." "Lyra," she turned back to him. "Lyra Aldenmore. My father says I am to use the house name while I am here, which I think is more formal than necessary, but I have agreed to it." She glanced at the palace again. "Is the king present today?" "His Majesty is attending to court business. He will receive you this evening." "Good," she said it the way someone says good, when they mean they have already factored this in and are moving to the next piece of information. "I have a few things I would like to understand about how the court functions before I am expected to function in it. Arrangements, schedules, expectations." She paused. "I am not trying to be difficult. I simply find it easier to meet people when I understand the context first." Harwick studied her for a moment. In 22 years, he had developed a fairly reliable sense of which new arrivals were going to cause problems and which ones only appeared to be about to cause problems. He was not entirely sure in this case which category applied. "Of course," he said. "I will personally show you the East Wing, and we can discuss the court's schedule over tea." He gestured toward the steps. "Welcome to Ironville, Miss Aldenmore." She went up the steps without hesitation. She did not hold the railing. She did not look back at her caravan. She looked, Harwick thought, like someone who had already decided they were going to be fine, regardless of what fine required. The East Wing had been prepared with care. The rooms assigned to Lyra were 2 connected chambers, a sitting room with tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, and a bedroom with a wide hearth and a writing desk against the far wall. Someone in the household staff had placed fresh flowers on the writing desk. Someone else had arranged a small tray of food near the window. Lyra walked through both rooms with her hands behind her back, not touching anything, looking at everything. "The window faces east," she said. "Yes," Harwick said. "The morning light is considered quite pleasant." "I am an early riser, that is good." She stopped at the writing desk and looked at the flowers. "These are wildflowers, not garden flowers. We thought you might prefer something less formal, coming from the border regions." She looked at him then, and her expression shifted slightly, something that was not quite softness but was adjacent to it. "That was thoughtful, thank you." She sat down at the desk, pulled out the travel notebook she had kept in her coat, and opened it to a blank page. Harwick had seen many young people settle into their rooms at Ironville. They unpacked, they explored, they looked at the windows and commented on the view. They did not, in his experience, immediately open notebooks and begin writing things down. "Can you tell me," Lyra said, her pen already moving, "what the king's daily schedule looks like? Generally, not the private parts, just the structure." Harwick sat in the chair near the door, which she had not invited him to sit in but which she had also not asked him to leave. "His Majesty rises before dawn. He attends a brief meeting with his head guard at the first hour. Court business begins at the 3rd hour and runs until midday. He takes an afternoon for territorial correspondence and strategic planning, and formal dinners are held 3 nights per week." "Does he eat alone on the other nights?" "He dines privately, yes." "By choice or by schedule?" Harwick considered this. "Both, I believe." Lyra wrote something. "Is he well liked by the court?" "He is deeply respected." She looked up. "I asked if he is liked." "Respect and being liked are not always the same thing," Harwick said carefully. "No," Lyra agreed, "they are not." She looked back at her notebook. "I will not ask you anything that puts you in an uncomfortable position. I am simply trying to understand the environment." She paused. "My father's court is very different. There are 40 people, half of whom are related to us, and everyone knows everything about everyone before anyone says a word. A king's palace is a different kind of place." "It is. I imagine some people find it very isolating." Harwick said nothing. Lyra closed her notebook. She looked out the east-facing window at the garden below where the afternoon light was starting to angle toward gold. "I am not going to be a problem, Lord Harwick. I understand what I am here to be. My father has been clear and I am not naive about the politics of it." She turned back. "I am simply someone who pays attention to things. I realize that can read is difficult." "It is not meant to be." "I find," Harwick said slowly, "that people who pay attention to things are usually worth paying attention to." She smiled at that. It was not a court smile. It was a real one, quick and a little crooked, and it made her look younger for just a second. "That is either very wise or very kind. I'm not sure which." "Perhaps both." He stood. He had 17 more things to organize before the evening's formal reception, and the tea tray on the window ledge was going cold. "I will leave you to settle in. A companion will be assigned to help you prepare for this evening. The formal court presentation begins at the 7th hour. I will be ready." He was at the door when she spoke again. "Lord Harwick," he turned, the name on the eastern corridor wall. "The one with no epitaph. I saw it as we came through from the entrance." She was looking at him steadily. Who was she? The question landed in the room the way stones land in still water. Harwick was a careful man. He had not gotten to 22 years of service by being careless with what he knew. "That is a question," he said, "that I would suggest not asking in the king's presence." Lyra held his gaze. "I was not planning to." She turned back to her notebook. Harwick left. In the hallway he stood for a moment with his hand flat against the closed door. The word "spirited," he reflected, had been used by the chieftain of Aldenmore in the letter. It was a border pack word, and like most border pack communication, it had contained about 3 times more information than it appeared to. He walked back down the corridor toward the throne room and the 17 things waiting for him, and he thought, with the particular quiet dread of a man who has managed courts for a very long time, that the week ahead was going to be something other than ordinary. The throne room of Ironville held 300 people on formal evenings. Lyra had counted the approximate space from the doorway and arrived at this estimate before she had taken 3 steps inside. She had a habit of counting things in new places. It was something she had done since she was a child, and she had never fully decided whether it was a gift or a symptom. The room was high-ceilinged and lit by iron chandeliers that held real candles, not lanterns. Someone had made a point about that, she thought. Candles said, "We have people who tend to these. We do not need convenience." The floors were dark stone, polished to the point where she could see a blurred reflection of the chandeliers in them. The walls held tapestries in deep green and gray Ironville colors, each one depicting something historical. She made a note to look at them more carefully later, when she was not being watched by an entire court. She was, at this moment, being watched by an entire court. She had not dressed to impress. She had dressed appropriately, which was a distinction she was careful about. The gown was dark blue, practical, well-made, not elaborate. Her hair was up, held by 2 simple pins. She had no jewelry because she rarely wore jewelry, and she had decided early in life not to pretend to be something she was not in order to soften the effect of being something she was. What she was, a border pack ward in a king's court, 21 years old, not particularly noble in the decorative sense, with eyes that moved too quickly and opinions that arrived before invitations for them had been issued. She walked through the receiving line with her hands loose at her sides, shaking each extended hand, remembering names at a rate that would probably alarm people if they knew she was doing it, and keeping her expression at a careful neutral that she had worked very hard to develop, and that still did not quite fit her face properly. The court ladies assessed her the way court ladies always assessed new arrivals, not unkindly, not warmly, but with the professional thoroughness of people who understand that new arrivals change the balance of things and need to be categorized before anything else can happen. Lord Harwick moved beside her, introducing people, filling in titles and ranks with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this many times. Lyra listened to every word and stored them in the part of her mind that held maps and schedules and the names of people she might need to find later. And then the room shifted. She felt it before she saw it, the particular change that happens when the most important person in a space enters it. Not a sound, or not only a sound. A kind of attention that swings, like a compass finding north. Cale walked in from the side door. He was taller than she had expected, and she was not sure what she had expected. She had seen him described in her father's correspondence as formidable, which was a word that got applied to strong men and bad weather with equal frequency and told you almost nothing useful. She had seen him referenced in trade agreements as decisive, which told you a little more. She had seen, in the one portrait that hung in her father's study, a formal painting, stiff and official, a man with dark hair and even darker eyes who looked like he was tolerating being painted rather than sitting for it. The portrait had not lied exactly, but it had missed something. What it had missed was the quality of his stillness. Most powerful people moved through rooms in a way that made the room respond. They generated a kind of social weather around them, pulling attention, creating movement. Cale moved through the throne room the way something heavy and very sure of itself moves, not pulling attention, receiving it, as if the room was simply doing what rooms did when he was in them, and he neither required nor particularly noticed. He wore no crown. She had not expected a crown exactly, but she had expected something more ceremonial. He wore the deep gray of Ironville's formal colors and a single marking on his left shoulder that she recognized as the Alpha seal. That was all. His eyes moved across the room. They were doing what hers had done when she walked in, cataloging, assessing. She recognized the action because she did it herself. She did not, however, do it with that particular quality of absolute calm, as if nothing he might find in the room would require him to alter his expression. His eyes found her. She had been looked at by powerful people before. Her father was a chieftain. She had attended gatherings of border pack leaders since she was old enough to sit still through them. She knew the look that said, "You are a political consideration and I am filing you under that category." She knew the look that said, "You are someone's daughter and I am being polite." She knew the look that said, "You are a woman in my court and I am deciding what to make of that." What Cale's eyes said, in the 2 seconds they held hers, was harder to categorize. It was not warm, it was not cold. It was the look of someone who had looked at a great many things and trained himself not to react to them, and who was applying that training now. Then he moved on, and the room moved with him, and Lyra stood where she was for a moment before Lord Harwick touched her elbow and guided her gently toward the formal presentation position near the center of the room. She had 3 seconds to regulate her face. She used 2 of them. The formal presentation was protocol. Lyra had read the protocol in the document Lord Harwick had provided with her afternoon tea, and she had memorized it with the efficiency of someone who finds it easier to know the rules perfectly than to guess at them. She stepped forward at the right moment, gave the correct curtsy or something near it. She had practiced in her room and she knew it was functional rather than graceful, but it hit the required beats, and lifted her eyes when she was supposed to lift her eyes. She had not expected to meet his gaze from 2 feet away, and have it feel like walking into a room where the temperature was different from the hallway. "Miss Aldenmore," Cale said. His voice was exactly what she had expected from a man who said little, low, precise, with no excess in it. "Your Majesty," she said. "You traveled from Aldenmore without incident." "We did. The Eastern Road is better maintained than it was the last time I traveled it. Your road teams are doing good work." A beat, small, barely noticeable, but she noticed it. "I was not aware you had traveled the Eastern Road previously. 3 years ago with a trading party, I went to observe the border exchange protocols. My father thought it would be educational." She paused. He was right. Cale looked at her. Whatever he was doing with that look, he kept it behind the same even expression. "Welcome to Ironville. Lord Harwick will ensure you are comfortable." He moved to pass. "The Delvin push," she said. He stopped. She had not planned to say it. That was not entirely true. She had planned to say it at some later, more appropriate point, and the fact that it had arrived now, in the middle of a formal presentation, mid-curtsy, was the beast in her doing what the beast did, pressing against the careful container she kept around it and finding the seams. Cale turned back. The room, which had been in motion, had gone very still. "The push into the eastern corridor," she said, and now she was committed to it, so she kept her voice level and her eyes clear. "I passed through the lower Greyline Valley 2 days before arriving here. The Delvin scouts were already moving in the tree line. What your road teams are doing is good work, but their attention is on the road, not on the forest edge. If someone were watching the forest edge..." "They are." His voice had not changed. She could not tell if he was annoyed. That was unusual. She could usually tell. "Thank you, Miss Aldenmore." He moved away. The room held breath and all released. Lord Harwick appeared at her elbow with the smooth, urgent energy of someone who has just watched someone else do something that could either be very good or very bad, and has not yet determined which. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "after the presentations, you and I should discuss the protocols around unsolicited strategic input." "I know," she said. She watched Cale's back as he moved through the court, receiving the bow of a general, the nod of a lord. "I know I should not have said it. It was true and ill-timed. Both things can be accurate." Harwick looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "You are aware that interrupting the king's formal greeting with military intelligence is somewhat unusual." "I am aware." She turned away from watching Cale and looked at the room instead, at its 300 people, its candlelit chandeliers, its polished floors. He already knew about the forest edge. Harwick said nothing. "He did not react to the information," she said. "He reacted to me offering it. That is different." Harwick said nothing for another moment. Then, "You are quite observant, Miss Aldenmore." "I know." She smoothed the front of her gown, which did not need smoothing. "I am trying to decide if it is a problem." The dinner that followed was formal and long, and served 6 courses, which was 3 more than Lyra considered necessary. She sat at the lower end of the table, appropriate for a ward of her rank, between a court advisor named Frederick Wren, who was pleasant in the way that well-trained dogs are pleasant, and a general's wife named Helena Cole, who was pleasant in the way that women who have survived 20 years of military courts are pleasant, which was to say fully and efficiently, and without wasting it on people who weren't worth it. Lyra decided over the fish course that she liked Helena Cole. "You spoke to the king at the presentation," Helena said. She said it quietly between them, while Frederick Wren was engaged with the man to his right. "I did." "You said something about the eastern forests." "I did." Helena turned her wine glass very slightly. "My husband came back from that region 6 days ago. He did not mention forest movement." "He might not have been looking for it." Lyra ate her fish, which was excellent. "Or he might have seen it and not flagged it because it looked routine. The scouts are in small groups. They look like hunting parties if you're not watching the spacing." Helena was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been watching things like that?" "Since I was able to walk to the border fence without supervision." Lyra glanced down the long table. Cale was at the head at a distance that made his face unreadable. He was speaking to the man on his right, a lord she had not yet catalogued. His expression was, even from here, completely composed. "My father's territory is small. The borders matter more when the territory is small. You learn to pay attention." "The king pays attention too," Helena said. It was not quite a warning. It was more like someone noting the position of 2 things on a board, more than people realize. Lyra followed Helena's gaze down the table to where Cale sat. She had the particular feeling, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, but very alert, that she was being assessed by someone who was also being assessed, and that neither of them had admitted it yet. "I imagine he does," she said. She looked away and concentrated on her fish. After dinner there was what Harwick called informal court gathering, which was the court's way of doing exactly what they had been doing at dinner, but without the table to organize them. People moved and regrouped and had the same kinds of conversations in different configurations, and Lyra moved through it with her hands behind her back and her eyes open. She found herself standing in front of the eastern corridor wall, without entirely planning to be there. The memorial wall was simple: names, dates, epithets, soldiers, advisors, members of the royal family going back 4 generations. She read them the way she read maps, looking for the pattern, the shape of the information, what was present and what was not. The name near the center of the wall, carved in the same style as the others. No date range, which was unusual, just the name. Sira. No title, no epitaph, no dates. Just the single name, carved cleanly into the stone as if the person who had put it there had stood with the chisel for a long time and ultimately decided that the name was the only thing they could manage. Lyra stood there for 3 seconds, then she walked back to the gathering. She did not find Cale in the crowd. She had not been looking for him. She found Helena Cole instead, near the window, and spent the rest of the evening learning about the court's unofficial social architecture from a woman who had been navigating it for 2 decades and who, Lyra suspected, knew more about how Ironville actually functioned than half the generals in the room. She did not look at the eastern wall again. but she thought about it for a long time after she went to bed. The name with no epitaph on a wall full of them. The king who had been ruling alone for 6 years. The beast that the court never spoke about, not directly, but that was in the edges of every sentence that touched on the king's nature, hinted at, circled, left unnamed. The single name, no dates, no explanation. Lyra lay in the wide east wing bed and listened to the palace settle into its nighttime sounds, the distant footfall of guards, the creak of old wood, the wind against the tall windows, and thought about the things that people carve into stone when they cannot find words large enough. She thought about what it costs a person to carry something that heavy. And then she closed her eyes, because tomorrow the court would begin, and she had a great many things to pay attention to. She woke before the sun. This was not unusual for her. She had woken before sunrise her entire life, a habit formed in the border territories where the early hours belonged to the people who used them. The farmers, the patrol riders, the women who ran the pack's food stores and who were already halfway through their first tasks before the rest of the world had opened its eyes. In Ironville, the East Wing corridor was empty and dim. The tall windows had gone the particular shade of dark blue that comes in the last hour before dawn, and the palace was making its slow, deep sounds of transition. Somewhere below, the kitchens were waking up. Somewhere above, a guard was completing the last round of a night shift. She dressed quickly and went out. The gardens were frosted at the edges. Her breath was visible in the cold air. She walked the paths with her hands in her pockets, moving in the careful, aware way she moved when she was outside an unfamiliar perimeter, tracking, not wandering. The garden was larger than it had appeared from her window. There were 3 distinct sections: a formal garden near the palace wall, a wilder section that had not been managed for aesthetics but had clearly been managed for something, she could not tell what yet, and a far section near the eastern gate that held what appeared to be a collection of old trees, the kind that had been there before the palace was built. She went to the old trees. She stood among them for a while. They were enormous things, 3 or 4 of them ancient enough that their bark had gone thick and deeply ridged, and their roots had pushed up through the stone path that had been laid around them at some point, the path routing around the roots rather than having ever considered cutting them out. Someone at some point had decided these trees were worth accommodating. She was looking at the way the roots had split the oldest stone when she heard footsteps on the path, measured, unhurried, certain. She turned. Cale stopped a few feet from the edge of the tree line. He was not in court dress. He was in something darker and simpler, clearly made for movement, and his expression in the early morning light was the same expression it had been in the throne room, which was to say, contained, composed. She had been in his garden before dawn. She waited for this to be a problem. He looked at her, then at the trees, then back at her. The old pines, he said. It was not quite an explanation and not quite a question. I was curious about them, she said. I saw them from my window. Most of the garden looks managed, these do not. They were here when the first stone of the palace was laid, he said. My great-great-grandfather had 2 choices, move the trees or move the plans. He paused. He moved the plans. That is a surprisingly flexible thing for a founding king to do. Something shifted in his expression, not much, a small rearrangement. He was practical. The trees were 300 years old. The palace needed only to be built once. She looked at the roots pushing through the stone path. So the path goes around them. The path goes around them. She turned back to him. He had not moved from the edge of the tree line, which was 5 or 6 feet from where she stood. In the early morning light, without the court around him and the formal structure of the throne room, he looked like a different thing. Not softer exactly, more present maybe. The court held him in a kind of amber, preserved, observable, untouchable. Out here, he was just a man standing in a garden before dawn. I should not be in your garden, she said. The garden is accessible to the household, he said. You are part of the household. A pause. The hour is unusual. I wake early, border habit. She looked at him. You also wake early. Yes. Do you come here every morning? His eyes moved to the old trees. Most. She considered this, alone. Yes. She nodded. She understood the thing he was not saying, that this was his quiet hour, his private space, and that she was standing in the middle of it. She was preparing to excuse herself when he did something she had not expected. He stepped into the tree line and stopped beside the largest of the old pines, looking up at its canopy. Not at her, at the tree. "The eastern forest movement you described last evening," he said. She was quiet. "The spacing pattern you observed, you said it looked like hunting parties." "The intervals were consistent," she said carefully. "Approximately 40 feet between individuals. Hunting parties use something closer to 20 because they are moving toward a common target. At 40 feet, you are covering ground, not concentrating on it." He was quiet for a moment. "You have been trained in border surveillance." "No formal training. My father's territory borders 3 packed territories and 2 disputed zones. I have been watching the borders since I was 12. He turned from the tree and looked at her, the same assessing look as the night before. She held it without difficulty, which she was aware was not the reaction most people had to being assessed by Kale. "The forest edge observation was accurate," he said. "My scouts confirmed the movement pattern this morning." She said nothing. "You should not have raised it in the middle of a formal court presentation," he said. "I know. But the information was correct." "Yes." He looked at her for another moment, then turned and walked back down the garden path the way he had come. At the edge of the formal section, he stopped without turning back. "Breakfast is served at the 2nd hour. Harwick can show you the schedule for the court day." Then he was gone, back toward the palace entrance. Lyra stood among the old trees and breathed the cold morning air and thought about the look in his eyes, not warm, not cold, but something that had been turned carefully away from being either. She went back inside when the sky began to go gold. 3 weeks into her time at Ironvale, Lyra had mapped the entire palace. Not officially. There was an official map, which Harwick had provided on her 2nd day, and it was accurate in the way that official maps of large buildings are accurate. It showed where the walls were and did not show anything about who went where, and why, and at what hours, and what it meant when a particular corridor was occupied or empty. She had mapped that second thing, the real geography. The west corridor near the armory was busy in the early morning and empty by midday, which meant the guard rotation used it as a route, but the court staff avoided it. The library was occupied from the 3rd hour to the 6th most days, by a rotating selection of advisors and the king's 2 secretaries, but the back corner near the south window was almost always empty, which was where she went when she needed to think without being observed. The formal dining room was never used on Wednesdays, which was a piece of information no one had told her, but that she had arrived at by noticing the dining staff's movement patterns and their absence. These were the kinds of things she tracked. She had always tracked them. Her father had once said, with the particular mixture of pride and mild exasperation that colored most of his assessments of her, that she was the best border scout he had never formally trained. She had pointed out that this was because he had not thought to train her, and he had said, "Yes, exactly," which was the kind of sentence that did not fully make sense but that she had understood perfectly. Ironvale was a more complex territory than Aldenmore. More people, more layers, more of the invisible social machinery that large courts ran on. But the principle was the same. Watch long enough and the pattern emerges. Be patient with the noise and eventually the signal becomes clear. The signal she had been watching most carefully moved through the palace at the 2nd hour every morning, attended 2 briefings before midday, disappeared for approximately 90 minutes in the early afternoon, and then reappeared in the war room or the throne room for the balance of the day. The signal wore gray. The signal had not in 3 weeks spoken to her again after the early morning garden conversation, which she was tracking because absence of communication was also a form of communication. She was not tracking him, that was not what she told herself. She was learning the court, he was part of the court. The argument happened on a Wednesday, which meant it happened in a dining room that was supposed to be empty. She had been there first, using the long table to spread out her father's correspondence, which she was sorting and answering in the particular methodical order she applied to correspondence, not chronological, but by type of problem, because problems of the same kind are better solved together than sequentially. The light from the south windows was good at this hour. She had been there for 40 minutes, comfortable in the silence, when the door opened. Kale stopped in the doorway. She looked up, he looked at her, then at the correspondence spread across his dining room table. "The dining room is not in use on Wednesdays," she said, which was not an apology but acknowledged the information. "Correct," he said. He came in anyway, which she had not expected, and moved to the sideboard where a tray of documents had apparently been left for exactly this kind of informal afternoon stop. He took the documents and moved toward the window at the far end of the table, which was as far as possible from where she was sitting. They worked in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. She was aware of him the way you are aware of something large and present, the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not thinking about it directly but factoring in its heat. She organized her correspondence. He read his documents. The afternoon light moved across the table. "The Millhaven trade agreement," she said. He looked up. She was looking at a letter from her father, which referenced a Pack 3 territories east of Aldenmore. "My father has been approached by the Millhaven traders about a wool route through the lower Grey Line. If the Delvin situation continues to push the eastern corridor further north, the Millhaven route becomes the most viable option for most border pack trading this winter." He set down his documents. "That is a concern I am already aware of." "I know, I am telling you because the alternative route they are considering goes through a section of the forest that my father's territory technically overlaps. If that route activates, there will be a jurisdiction question that is going to need to be addressed before winter, not after." He looked at her steadily. "You are representing your father's interests. I am telling you a thing that is true, which happens to involve my father's interests and yours." She met his gaze. "Those are not always the same thing." A pause, something moved behind his eyes, a reassessment, quick and precise. "What jurisdiction does your father claim over that forest section?" "A seasonal one, hunting rights primarily, but seasonal rights become complicated when they are activated by a trading dispute because the legal category changes." She set down her own letter. "I am not asking you to make a decision about it today. I am flagging it because someone should be aware of it before it becomes an emergency, and I appear to be the person in this palace who is in possession of all the relevant information." "You are telling me," he said, "that you are a useful resource." "I am telling you that I know things about the eastern border territories that your intelligence network does not, because I have lived in them." She was careful to keep her voice neutral, not defensive, not aggressive, just clear. "I am a ward here, which is a political arrangement, and I understand that. But the arrangement does not require me to keep information to myself that would be useful to your governance." He was quiet for a moment. In that quiet she could feel, and this was the particular quality of him that she had not been able to catalogue and place in the 3 weeks she had been watching, a kind of attention that was different from the administrative attention he applied to his documents and his briefings. That attention was efficient. This was something else, more considered. "You are not what Harwick described," he said. "Lord Harwick described me as spirited, I am aware." "He described you as spirited," Cale said, "and someone who pays attention to things. Those were his exact words." "That is accurate." "What he did not describe," he said, "is someone who processes border intelligence while answering correspondence and then presents it without being asked." She had not meant this as an argument. It had become one sideways, the way conversations with her sometimes did, by following the logic of the information rather than the social architecture of the room. She was aware that she had, again, gone further and faster than the protocol suggested was appropriate. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not mean to push past the lines of what is welcome." He looked at her for a long, measured moment. "You observed the Delvin spacing pattern correctly. You identified a jurisdiction problem before it became a crisis. These are not things to apologize for." She waited. "The way you deliver them," he said, "needs consideration." She almost said, "And how would you prefer I deliver them?" She did not say it. She recognized that for what it was, the beast in her, pushing at the container, looking for an argument it could win, and she held it back. "Understood," she said instead. He picked up his documents again. She picked up her correspondence. The afternoon light continued to move across the table. After a few minutes he said, "The Millhaven route, what is the specific forest section your father's seasonal rights cover?" She told him. He listened without writing anything down, which she noted, because it meant he was either committing it to memory or deciding it was not significant enough to record, and from what she had observed of Cale, it was the former. They worked until the light began to fail, and then she gathered her correspondence and left, and he remained at the far end of the table with his documents, and neither of them remarked on the hour they had spent in the same room not quite talking, and yet communicating with a specificity that formal conversation rarely achieved. Helena Cole found her in the library the next morning. Helena Cole was, Lyra had established, someone who found people the way water finds the lowest path naturally without announcing the route. "You were in the Wednesday dining room yesterday afternoon," Helena said, sitting across from her in the back corner near the south window. "I was using the table for correspondence space. The king was also there. He came in after I was already there. I offered to move, he told me to remain." She turned a page in the archive she was reading. It was not remarkable. Helena was quiet in the particular way she got quiet when she was deciding how much to say. People will notice. People notice everything in a court. That is the function of a court. Lyra, Helena said her name with a gentle but clear weight. The king does not share rooms with people. It is not a protocol. It is simply something he does not do. Lyra set down the archive. We were both working at opposite ends of a very large table. "I know what you were doing. I am telling you what it looks like." Lyra considered this. Helena Cole, she had decided in the first week, was one of the handful of people in Ironville worth genuinely listening to. Not because she always said the right thing, but because she always said a true thing. There was a difference. "He does not dislike me," Lyra said. It came out slightly differently than she had intended, more certain than she had intended. Helena studied her. "No," she said slowly, "I do not think he does. He is difficult to read. He is very difficult to read. But he is not avoiding me. He could have asked me to leave the dining room. He did not." "He did not," Helena agreed. Lyra looked at the archive. The words had stopped meaning anything for the moment. What was she like, the woman on the memorial wall, Sira? Helena's expression shifted. Not closed, Helena Cole's face did not close easily but careful. "I knew her a little, not well. She was from the Northern Territories." A pause. "She was very warm, very open, exactly the kind of person you would never expect to." She stopped. "She died suddenly, there was no preparation for it, and the king..." Another stop. "You do not have to tell me," Lyra said. "He was a different person before," Helena said quietly. "Not better or worse, different. The beast in him was present in the way a beast is supposed to be present. You could feel it in a room with him the way you feel weather changing." After, she shook her head. "It went quiet, and he has held everything else together since, perfectly the way he holds everything. But the beast has not spoken, not in 6 years." Lyra looked at her hands on the archive. 6 years is a long time. "It is." Helena looked at the south window. "I tell you this because you are clearly paying attention to things, and I would rather you have accurate information than insufficient information." "Thank you," Lyra said. She meant it plainly, without decoration, and Helena received it the same way. After Helena left, Lyra sat for a long time with her hands on the closed archive and thought about a person who had learned to be a perfect king while carrying something that heavy. Who had learned to hold everything together with the beast locked away, not because it was a choice, but because the grief had been so large that the beast had simply refused to move inside it. She thought about what it might feel like to carry a silence like that. She thought about the old pine trees, and the path that went around the roots instead of through them, and the king who came there every morning before the court woke up. She opened the archive again and found her place and read, and outside the south window the late autumn sky was the particular clear gray of a morning that knows winter is coming, and is not bothering to pretend otherwise. She had been at Ironville for 23 days when she attended her first actual war council. This had not been arranged for her. Harwick had not scheduled it. What had happened was that she had been in the corridor outside the war room on an errand that was genuinely unrelated. She was returning a map she had borrowed from the cartographer's assistant, when the door opened and General Cole walked out with the particular expression of a man who had just been in a meeting that required more information than the meeting currently held. He saw her, he stopped. "Miss Aldenmore," he was a direct man. She had noticed this in him from the beginning, the way she noticed useful qualities in people, the way a carpenter notices straight grain in wood. "You know the lower eastern territories better than most people at Ironvale," she said, which was honest rather than boastful. "We have a dispute over the location of a seasonal stream that forms part of the Grey Line boundary. The cartographer's records place it 2 miles north of where my scouts are finding it. Streams in the lower Grey Line move seasonally," she said. In autumn they run north of their summer positions, if your cartographer's records were made in summer. Cole turned and went back into the war room, leaving the door open. She stood in the corridor for a moment, then she followed. There were 6 people in the war room: General Cole, 3 men she recognized as border advisors, the cartographer, and Cale at the head of the table, who looked at her when she came through the door with an expression that did not quite succeed at being purely administrative. "The stream migration," she said, because she was in the room now and there was no useful way to be in a room silently when you had information relevant to the room's purpose. In the lower gray line, the primary tributaries shift northward in autumn as the upper snowmelt decreases. By mid-autumn they can be as much as 3 miles north of their summer beds. By midwinter they are largely frozen and the position is fixed until spring. She moved to the map. She was aware of Cale watching her. She pointed to a section of the river marked in blue. If this record is from summer, the actual current position would be approximately here. She moved her finger 2.5 miles north. Which, if I am reading this correctly, puts it inside the boundary of your gray line northern post, not outside it. The cartographer looked at the map, then at Cole, then at Cale. "Verify it," Cale said. He said it to Cole, not to her, but his eyes were on her when he said it. Cole nodded. The cartographer began rolling his map. "How do you know the stream migration pattern?" one of the border advisors asked. He was not unfriendly. He was genuinely curious in the way that people who work with territorial data are genuinely curious when they encounter someone with information they don't have. "I have crossed the lower gray line in 3 different seasons," she said. "You learn what moves and what stays still." "What else moves?" she told them. She stayed in the war room for 2 hours, answering questions that got progressively more specific as the advisors confirmed, through their own records and her information, that she knew what she was talking about. She was careful about what she was certain of and what she was speculating about. She said "I don't know" 4 times, which she always believed was more useful than offering false certainty. Cale did not ask questions. He listened. He was very good at listening. She had noticed this about him early. He listened the way someone listens when they are building something in their mind from the material being provided. He did not fill silences. He did not prompt unnecessarily. He sat at the head of his war room and listened to a ward from a border pack describe stream migration patterns, and his face told her very little, and his attention told her everything. When she was done and the advisors had what they needed, and the cartographer had made 3 pages of notes, she stepped back from the map. "Thank you," Cale said. He said it simply and directly, not the formal thanks of a king dismissing a subject, something more functional, the thanks of someone who has been given genuinely useful information and is acknowledging the fact of it. "Of course," she said. She left the war room. In the corridor she stood for a moment and let out a slow breath, and noticed that her hands, which had been perfectly steady while she was pointing at the map, were now showing the very slight tremor that came with the release of focus. She had been useful, in a room that mattered, with information that was not decorative but real. She walked back toward the east wing and told herself this was simply a ward fulfilling her natural role, contributing the knowledge her background provided, serving the court as a ward was meant to serve. She told herself this very clearly and with great specificity. Her beast, that wild, pressing, inconvenient thing, told her something different, told her she was not thinking about usefulness or wards or natural roles. She walked faster. The beast did not keep quiet. It had never in 21 years kept quiet when she had told it to. It pressed against the container she kept around it, and it told her what she already knew and did not want to know, that the war room and the map and the 2 hours of concentrated work had been interesting not because of the map. She went to the garden. The old pine trees were cold in the afternoon, and she put her hand on the bark of the largest one and stood there until her hands stopped trembling. The path goes around the roots, she told herself. It does not go through them. She stayed there until the light changed, and then she went inside, and she did not think about the way Cale's attention had felt, like something very still deciding whether to move. She touched him on a Thursday. It was not planned. That is the first thing she would have said if anyone had asked, which no one did, because no one in the court was prepared to raise the subject with either of them directly. It was not planned and it was not insignificant, and for the rest of that afternoon she sat in her east wing room and looked at her own hand as if it had done something without consulting her. Which it had. The argument had started, as their arguments usually did, sideways, not as a declared argument, but as a conversation that followed its logic further than either of them had apparently intended. They had been in the corridor outside the war room, and she had been telling him something about the border tax structure that she had found in her father's correspondence, and he had been listening in that complete, contained way he had that was somehow more destabilizing than if he had interrupted. She had said, the Eastern Pac leaders will not maintain the agreement long-term if the tax structure continues to advantage the Central Territories. It is not that they are disloyal, it is that the structure makes loyalty economically irrational. He had said, the structure is what the structure is. It was negotiated over 3 years. I know, I'm not saying renegotiate it. I am saying that in its current form, you will begin losing voluntary compliance within 18 months. The Eastern Pacs are patient people. They will wait until the arrangement becomes sufficiently disadvantageous and then they will stop complying. She had paused. It is not defiance, it is math. Border Pacs, he had said, with a precision that was not quite dismissive but was in the general direction of it, have narrower views of trade than territorial-level governance requires. She had stared at him. I did not mean, he began. You said that border Pacs have narrow views. She kept her voice very controlled. My father has governed his territory for 30 years. 3 of those years were spent keeping the lower trade routes open during the Ashford drought, which he did by personally negotiating with 2 rival Pac leaders, while your court was still commissioning reports about the drought's projected duration. A beat. I am aware of what your father did during the Ashford drought, Cale said. His voice had not changed. This was the thing that made him impossible to argue with in the traditional sense. He did not escalate, he simply maintained. Then you are aware that narrow views did not accomplish it. I misspoke, he said. It was direct and undecorated, not an apology in the elaborate sense but a correction stated as flatly as a fact. She was not quite done being annoyed. This was the other thing about him, that his precision and his composure, and his habit of being correct about most things made the moments when he was not correct about something simultaneously satisfying and deeply irritating, because the satisfaction was cut short by his immediate and undefended acknowledgement that he had been wrong, which left her nowhere to put the remaining annoyance. Fine, she said. He turned to walk back toward the war room. She put her hand around his wrist. She did it to stop him from walking away before she had finished the thought she was in the middle of, which was not a good enough reason, which she understood the moment her fingers closed around his wrist and felt him go completely still. Not the contained stillness he walked around in all day. Something else, something that started in him the moment she made contact and spread outward through whatever composed and managed surface he kept over himself, underneath which was something she had not expected to find so immediately or so clearly. He did not pull away, he did not move at all. She let go. The Eastern Pac leaders, she said, and her voice had changed slightly, she could hear it, she could not fix it fast enough, are the most important compliance base you have for the border agreement, and they will need at least some structural adjustment within the year. That is what I was going to say. He turned back, his face was its controlled self, which meant nothing, which was the problem. But his eyes, there was something in his eyes that had not quite had time to clear before he turned, and it was not nothing. She did not know what it was, exactly. She only knew it was the first thing she had seen in him that was not behind the wall. I will have Ren prepare an analysis of the Eastern structure, he said. His voice was level, completely level. If you would be willing to review it with the specific compliance concerns you are identifying, that would be useful. Yes, she said, that would work. He walked back toward the war room. He did not look back. She stood in the corridor for a long moment. Her hand, the one that had done the unauthorized thing, hung at her side. She put it in her pocket. That night she could not sleep. This was not new for her. She slept erratically at the best of times, her mind continuing its work long past the point when her body had finished with the day. But the specific texture of this sleeplessness was different from the kind that came from too many things to process. This was focused in a way that would not generalize into useful thinking. She lay in the wide east-wing bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the moment his wrist had been under her hand, and the way the stillness that had come over him was not the stillness of composure. She had touched people before, she was not a person who avoided contact in principle. Border packs were not formal about physicality in the way that courts were formal about it. You shook hands, you embraced people you knew, you gripped an arm to make a point. It was ordinary. What had happened when she touched his wrist was not ordinary. She had felt, and this was the thing she kept returning to, because she was a person who needed to understand things accurately and imprecisely, was not something she accepted from herself. She had felt the beast in him. Not seen, not heard, felt, a pressure from very far down like a vibration through stone, something that had been still for a long time and had, at the point of contact, moved. She was not a telepath, she could not read beasts. Nobody could read another person's beast directly, but she had her own beast, persistent, inconvenient, pressing, and it had, when she touched him, recognized something, responded to something. The way one instrument resonates when another nearby instrument sounds the same note. She got out of bed, she went to the writing desk. She wrote to her father, which she did every 2 weeks and which she was 3 days behind on. She wrote about the court schedule and the war council she had attended and Helena Cole and the Eastern trade question. She wrote about the palace gardens and the old pine trees and the fact that the court library had a surprisingly good collection of border pack historical records. She wrote 3 pages with the efficiency of someone who is filling a container that needs to be filled. She did not write about the corridor. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing correspondence and went back to bed, and this time she slept, and if she dreamed she did not remember it in the morning, which she decided was for the best. The next day, Cale acted as if the corridor had not happened. This was, on its face, what she had expected. What she had not expected was how much information was contained in the specific quality of that acting as if. She had seen him manage the court, manage his generals, manage political visitors, manage Harwick and the advisors, and every other configuration of people his position required him to manage. She knew what his professional composure looked like. What she saw the next day was professional composure, at about 30% more effort than usual. He was still at it by the afternoon, and this was the tell: he was very good, and when Cale was very good at something, you could not see the effort. When she could see the effort, it meant the effort was larger than his ability to fully conceal it. She found this information both clarifying and alarming. She sat through a long afternoon of court business, a merchant dispute, a pack alliance renewal, a report from the northern garrison that General Cole presented with his usual economy of words, and she kept her attention on the content of each thing, which was her habit, and she kept the part of her mind that was tracking the king's internal weather very quiet, like a person holding a bowl of water and trying not to spill. At the end of the afternoon session, as people were filing out, Frederick Wren appeared at her side with a sheaf of documents. The Eastern Structure Analysis, Miss Aldenmore. His Majesty has asked that you review these and add your observations. She took the documents. Thank you, Frederick. He has asked that you submit the review by the end of the week. Frederick Wren was pleasant and diligent, and had the specific quality of being utterly without agenda, which made him very easy to be around. He indicated that your observations on compliance timelines would be particularly valuable. She looked at the documents. They were detailed, more detailed than she had expected, which meant someone had prepared them quickly and with care. She looked at the top page, at the handwriting in the margins, not Frederick's neat secretarial script, but a different hand, angular and precise. Cale had written notes in the margins himself. He had read the structure before passing it to her, and he had written his own questions in the margins, and the questions were good, pointed in the exact places where the data was thinnest, asking exactly the things she would have asked if she were reading it for the first time. She stood in the corridor holding the documents and felt something shift in her chest, which was not a feeling she had a category for, which she did not like at all. She went back to her room. She sat at the writing desk with the documents and began reading, and for 2 hours she did nothing but work, which was one of the only reliable cures she had found for the particular kind of thinking she was trying not to do. She filled 3 pages with observations, corrections, and projected compliance timelines, and she was thorough and precise and referenced her sources and was, by the end of it, producing the best analytical work she had ever put on paper, which was a function of needing very badly to prove to herself that the only thing going on here was useful work. She submitted the review before dinner. At dinner, Cale read it at the head of the table while the first course was being served, which was not something kings typically did with court documents at formal meals, and which caused 3 of his generals to exchange glances that they thought were subtle. He looked up once down the table and met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he went back to reading. She ate her soup and told her beast to be quiet. The beast was not quiet. 2 days later, Harwick found her in the library and told her, with the careful face of a man delivering information he is not sure how to frame, that the king had asked to speak with her in the study at the 4th hour. Not the war room, the study. She said, "Thank you," and went back to the archive she was reading, and when Harwick had left she sat very still for a moment and then continued reading, because the archive was genuinely interesting, and because she was not going to spend 2 hours reconstructing what a private meeting in the king's study might mean. She spent 1 hour and 50 minutes doing exactly that. The study was in the inner section of the palace, one of the rooms that the east wing corridors did not connect to directly. She had never been inside it. From the outside it was an unremarkable door, no handles, just a latch, no markings, which she had learned was Cale's preference. He did not mark things that he used, he marked things that needed to be found by others. His personal spaces were left quiet on the outside, which she found interesting for reasons she had not fully unpacked. Harwick walked her there and knocked and opened the door. The study was not what she had expected. She had expected the administrative precision that ran through every other space he occupied, organized, functional, arranged for efficiency. The study was those things. Technically, the desk was clear, the shelves were ordered, the lamps were well positioned, but it was also something else, something lived in. There were books stacked at angles on the lower shelves, which was not a sign of disorder but of use, the way books look when they are read and returned quickly. There was a worn spot on the chair arm. There was a window facing north, which captured no useful daylight in the afternoon, which meant the window was there for the view rather than the light. She looked out the window. The northern mountains were visible, blue and distant. "Thank you for coming," Cale said. He was at the desk, but he was not behind it in the formal sense. He was to the side of it, leaning against it with his arms folded, which was more relaxed a posture than she had ever seen on him in a court context. "Of course," she said. "Your review of the Eastern structure," he picked it up from the desk, "it is excellent." She waited. "The compliance projections you have given for the 3 primary pact territories are specific enough to be actionable. Ren is incorporating them into the formal policy review." He set the document down. "The question I wanted to ask you, and I am asking it here rather than in the war room because I want a direct answer rather than a formal one, is how confident you are in the 18-month timeline." "Very confident for the Aldenmore adjacent territories," she said. "The 2 packs further east less so. They have longer complaint tolerances than the border packs. They may give it 24 months. Could you extend the review to cover those 2 territories specifically, before the end of next week?" "Yes." He nodded. A pause. "How long are you planning to stay at Ironville?" The question was not in the expected sequence of the conversation. She absorbed the shift. "The ward arrangement my father established is open-ended. He said I should stay as long as I am useful. I had assumed 6 months was the expected." "That is the typical duration," he said, "though typical is a function of circumstances." She looked at him. The north-facing window behind him framed the blue mountains and the gray afternoon sky. He was looking at her with the same level attention he had applied to her review, which was not nothing. "I am useful here," she said carefully. "Yes," he said it simply, the way he said everything without excess. "You are." She stood in the king's private study and held the careful shape of that exchange in her mind, its architecture, what was said and not said, where the weight in it lived, and said, "Then I will stay as long as I am needed." He nodded. "Good." She waited for more. There was not more. She said, "Is that all?" "Yes, then thank you for the review." She walked back out into the corridor, and Harwick was waiting and walked her back toward the east wing, and she looked at the palace walls going past and thought about the north-facing window and the view of the mountains and a man who had chosen a study room for a view rather than light, which meant he sat in that room and looked at the distant mountains when there was no administrative reason to be doing so. And this told her something she was adding to the map she was building of a person who was nothing like she had expected, and everything she had not been prepared for. "Harwick," she said. "Yes, Miss Aldenmore." "How long has he had that study?" Harwick was quiet for a beat. "Since the 2nd year of his reign." "And before that?" He used the formal library, as most kings do. What changed? Harwick said very quietly. He needed somewhere that was his own. He paused. That is my assessment. He has never said as much. She walked the rest of the way back to the East Wing in silence. She had a review to extend, and a timeline to pressure test, and approximately 47 other things to do. She was going to do all of them, and she was going to do them well, and she was not going to think about the study or the mountains or the particular way he had said, "You are." She sat down at her writing desk and opened the documents and started working. Her beast sat at the edge of her attention and was patient with her, which was unusual for it, and which she did not entirely trust. She found it by accident. She had not been looking for the armory at midnight. She had been looking for the door to the lower east corridor, which in the dark of a sleepless night at an hour when the palace had gone entirely quiet, looks a great deal like the door to the armory if you have not walked the route enough times to have the handle shapes memorized. She opened the wrong door. The armory was large and still and smelled of metal and oil. The weapons on the walls caught the low light from the single lamp by the door, a lamp that burned through the night, maintained by a night guard who was apparently elsewhere in the current moment. The room was silent in the particular way of rooms that are designed for serious purposes and have never had to be anything else. Cale was standing in the center of it. He had his back to the door. He was in the simple dark clothing she had come to recognize as what he wore outside of court hours. He was not doing anything. He was not examining a weapon or cleaning anything or reviewing inventory. He was standing with his hand flat against the stone of the far wall, and he was completely still, and he was looking at nothing. She took in all of this in under 2 seconds, and then she took a step back, and her boot heel caught the edge of the door frame, and the sound it made was very small. He turned. She did not move. There was nowhere particularly useful to move to. In the lamplight his face was different, not the composed face of the court, not the precise face of the war room, not even the quietly focused face of the study. This was his face without the careful layers, and what it contained was something she had not seen on him before, not grief exactly, not grief as she had expected it to look on someone, which was in her experience either loud or collapsed. This was grief that had been carried for so long that it had become structural. The way a tree carries the record of hard winters in its rings, present in the grain of the wood, not as memory but as matter. She looked at his face for 1 second and then looked at the wall behind him, because the second would have been too much. "I opened the wrong door," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. "I was looking for the lower east passage." He said nothing. "I am sorry for intruding. I will." "Stay," he said. She stayed. He turned back to the wall, not all the way. He turned enough that he was no longer facing her directly, but she was still in his peripheral view, which was different from being turned away. She moved further into the room, not toward him, and sat on the bench along the weapons wall and did not say anything. The armory held its silence. She did not ask him what he was doing. She was capable of asking, and the question was there in the available language of the room, but she did not use it. She understood from the parts of the picture she could see that the question was not the right instrument. People who are holding very heavy things do not always need to be asked about the weight. Sometimes they need someone to sit in the room with them while they continue to hold it. She sat on the bench and looked at the weapons on the wall and said nothing. After a while, she did not count the minutes. He moved. He walked to the bench opposite hers, not close, and sat down. He leaned his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor between them and was quiet. She waited. She would have known what to say, he said. In most situations, she always knew what the room needed. A pause. "I did not always. I managed. She made it easier." Lara did not say anything. "I am not good at talking about it," he said. "I am aware of this. I have been told this." "You do not have to be good at it," she said. He looked at her. His expression was not behind the wall, which was the first time she had experienced this, and it was a great deal. She kept her face steady, which required more from her than she had available for it, and she met his eyes. 6 years is a long time to manage alone, she said. It was the only sentence she was going to offer. She was not going to unfold it, not going to add to it. She said it and let it land where it would land. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the floor again. "The court does not speak of it," he said. "I made it clear early that speaking of it was not something I required, and they were generous, they respected that." Yes, she said. It became easier after the first year, the carrying of it not lighter, easier to carry. She understood this. She had not experienced the specific grief he was describing, but she understood the mechanism of it, how something does not become smaller but you grow around it, and the growing around it is not the same as the pain being gone. Easier is not the same as well, she said. It is not meant to be, it is just easier. He was quiet then, yes. The armory held them in its large, still dark. She looked at the wall where his hand had been flat against the stone, and she thought about the gesture, not an examination of the wall, not a working action, a grounding action, a way of feeling something solid when the interior was not solid. She had her own version of it. Her version was tree bark. She had not made this connection until this moment, and making it now, in this room, at this hour, felt like a small knife in a place she had not known was available to be cut. The name on the wall, she said. I have not asked anyone about the lack of epitaph. He was quiet for a moment. I could not choose one. No. Everything I thought of was either too much or not enough. He paused. She would have been able to choose one. She was better at the exact right amount of a thing. Lyra looked at the floor. She thought about a person who had lived in the world with that quality, knowing the exact right amount, and what it must leave behind when they go, not just the love of them, the function of them. The way you had learned to move through the world partly, in relation to their measure of it. She sounds like someone worth missing, she said. It was a simple sentence. She had been very careful to make it simple, to give it no more weight than it could bear and no less. He looked at her again. Something in his face shifted in a way she could not name and did not try to. He sat with it for a moment, and then he nodded once very slightly and went back to looking at the floor. She stayed on the bench. After a while longer, she did not know how long, the armory had no clock, and she had stopped being aware of time at some point in the previous hour. He stood. You should sleep, he said. Probably, she agreed. She stood too. He picked up the lamp by the door and held it out, which meant she would have light for the corridor and he would navigate the armory in the dark, which he clearly knew well enough to do without it. She took the lamp. At the door she stopped. She did not turn back. The lower east passage is the third door on the right. I know, he said. She went out. The next morning she came down for breakfast at the second hour and everything was where it always was. Harwick at the sideboard, Frederick Wren with his morning documents, 3 court advisors engaged in the quiet preliminary argument they had every morning about the schedule, the kitchen staff moving through with their efficient purpose. Cale was at the head of the table. He was in full court attire. His face was composed, precise, and gave nothing away. He looked up when she entered and their eyes met, and she held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds the way she usually did, and then she moved toward her seat. She did not say good morning. He did not say good morning. This was within the normal range of their mornings. She sat down and poured tea, and picked up the documents Frederick Wren had prepared for her review and began reading them, and the court moved around her with its ordinary morning machinery. This was the way of it, she thought, the armory at midnight and then breakfast, the name with no epitaph and then the Eastern trade structure analysis, the weight of a thing carried and then the day, because the day kept arriving regardless of the weight. She thought about what Helena Cole had said, a different person before, not better or worse, different. She thought about the beast in him that had gone silent when Sira died, and she thought about the moment in the armory when it had moved, the very slight tremor of something very deep turning over. She thought about her own beast, which was currently doing something it had never done in her 21 years. It was waiting, quietly, not pressing, not looking for the seam in the container, just waiting with a patience that she found more unsettling than the pressing had ever been. The Millhaven route is confirmed, Harwick said, setting a letter in front of her. The traders have accepted the northern adjustment. Good, she said. She turned back to her documents and worked through the morning. At the midday break she went to the garden. She did not go to the old pine trees. She went to the formal garden near the palace wall, where the beds were empty for winter and the paths were clear, and she walked the paths twice in the cold air, and she breathed, and she was honest with herself in the way that she insisted on being honest with herself even when it was inconvenient. She had sat in the armory at midnight and listened to Cale talk about the woman he had lost, and it had cost her something. Not in a bad way, in the way that things which reach you actually cost. She was not the kind of person to spend that and not account for it. She was insignificant, inconvenient, and completely unsimple territory. She walked the formal garden paths a third time, and the cold air filled her lungs, and her beast was still waiting, still quiet, and she told it, I know, not yet." She went back inside. There was work to do, and work was the most reliable structure she had, and she was going to use it until the rest of the picture became clear enough to look at without flinching. The story of Sira came to her in pieces over the following weeks, not through any single conversation, but through the accumulation of small disclosures that happened around the edges of other things, the way you come to understand a landscape not by looking at it all at once, but by walking through it in different weathers and at different hours. From Helena Cole, Sira had been from the Northern Territories. A healer's daughter, she had come to Ironville as part of a Northern Alliance negotiation and had stayed because the king had not wanted her to leave, which she had not, and which had apparently been, by all accounts, an entirely mutual and uncomplicated decision. This was, Helena noted, unusual for royalty in general and for Kale in particular. From Harwick, in a moment of unusual openness that Lyra suspected was deliberate, the marriage had been 3 years before Sira died. The 3 years had coincided with the most stable and prosperous period Ironville had known. He had said this without inflection and without looking at her, and had then gone back to the staff schedule he was reviewing. From General Cole, without meaning to disclose anything at all, a mention in passing of the Eastern Trade Agreement that had been signed in the 3rd year, when the king was, the court was in better shape, and then a clearing of the throat and a change of subject that confirmed what the sentence had almost said. She had found one other thing herself, not from any person but from the palace archives, a record of a garden planting from 6 years ago. In the month of the death she had inferred from context, a record noting that 4 old pine saplings had been added to the existing grove at the king's personal instruction, the saplings that were now the younger trees standing among the ancient ones. He had planted trees. In the month he lost her, he had planted trees in the place he went to be alone, and they had grown for 6 years alongside the ones that were already there, and he went to the grove every morning before the court woke up, and he stood among the trees he had planted and the trees that had been there before him, and he was whatever he was in that hour before the day required him to be something else. She had stood in the archive with this record for a long time. She had not told anyone what she found. She carried it the way she was learning to carry a number of things about Kale, carefully, and without trying to do anything with them yet, because the picture was still forming, and she was a person who needed to see things clearly before she acted on them. What she could see clearly, 6 weeks into her time at Ironville, was this. She had come as a ward, and she was useful as a ward, and the court was beginning to treat her as something between a ward and an advisor, which was a category that did not formally exist but that was emerging from the weight of what she actually contributed. What she could see clearly, that she was less willing to name. She was watching for him in every room she entered. She was noticing the angle of his shoulders in the morning meetings and calibrating, without intending to, whether the day ahead was going to be heavy or ordinary. She was tracking the rare occasions when something small shifted at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, not quite, but its distant relative, and filing these moments with a care that was entirely out of proportion with any practical purpose. She was, in the language her mother would have used, a woman standing at the edge of a thing she had not planned to be standing at the edge of. Her mother would have also said, "Well, here you are, what are you going to do about it?" Lyra had not yet answered this question. She was not, by nature, a person who avoided making decisions. She was the kind of person who made them early and committed to them, and dealt with the consequences with a directness that other people sometimes found bracing. But this particular decision had a quality that her other decisions had not had. It affected someone else at a depth she could not fully see, and she was not going to be careless about what she could not see. He was a man who had lost something enormous, and who had rebuilt himself around the loss with a precision that was not cold but was very careful. She had watched him for 6 weeks. She had been in the armory with him at midnight. She had read his margin notes on her documents and recognized in them the same quality of attention she applied to things she genuinely cared about. She had seen, once, the look in his eyes when she met his gaze without the wall between them, and she knew what that look was, even though neither of them had named it. She was not going to rush into this. She was not going to rush into this in the way that she did not rush into border negotiations or trade analysis, or any other territory where moving too fast meant missing something essential. She would wait, she would keep doing her work, which was excellent and was becoming more clearly necessary by the week. She would keep talking to him in the war room and the corridor and the Wednesday dining room. She would keep going to the garden in the mornings and not always going to the old pine trees, but sometimes going to the old pine trees. She would be patient. Her beast, which had been waiting quietly since the corridor, was still patient, still, like an animal that has decided its best strategy is to not startle the thing it is watching. Lyra had lived with her beast her entire life. She knew its moods and its methods. She had never seen it choose patience before, and she did not know what to make of it, and she was keeping an eye on it with the same careful attention she kept on the border tree lines. Something was coming, she did not know what shape it would take. She worked and she waited, and the winter deepened around the palace of Ironville, and in the mornings the old pine trees stood in the frost and the king stood among them, and somewhere in the space between one day and the next, something was building toward its own conclusion whether either of them was ready for it or not. She started dreaming about him in the 7th week. She did not tell anyone this, she made jokes to cover it. The jokes were, as jokes go, fairly good, quick, dry, the kind that deflected attention by being slightly too sharp for the thing they were about. Helena laughed at them. Frederick Wren smiled without quite knowing what at. The court ladies, who had by this point accepted Lyra with the resigned warmth of people who have decided that the inconvenient thing is here now and might as well be kept track of, received the jokes with varying degrees of comprehension. No one knew what the jokes were doing. This was the loneliest kind of funny. The dreams were not dramatic. They were not the kind of dreams she would have expected, nothing event-shaped, nothing that built to a revelation. They were ordinary-shaped, which was the specific thing about them that she could not put down, a corridor. Him at the end of it reading something, her walking toward him and him looking up, and in the dream the looking up was the significant event, the weight-bearing thing, the part that she woke from still carrying. She had told herself 6 weeks ago to be patient. She was being patient. She was being patient with a concentration that was becoming difficult to maintain, because patience had never been her natural mode, and she had only ever used it deliberately in situations where the alternative was worse, and she was beginning to need to be reminded more frequently of why the alternative was worse. The alternative was this: she could look at what she knew, which was considerable, and she could make a decision based on what she knew, and she could act on it, which was how she handled everything else in her life. The alternative to patience was her natural state. The reason not to. He was a man who had learned very carefully to hold himself together with the beast locked in silence, and the lock was working, and she was not going to be the person who carelessly broke it. She was not going to be careless. She was being patient. She was terrible at it. Winter came properly to Ironville in the 8th week. It came the way it came to mountain-adjacent kingdoms, decisively and all at once, the temperature dropping overnight and the first heavy snowfall arriving the next morning as if it had been scheduled. She woke to white light from the east window and the particular silence of heavy snow, and she stood at the window for a while looking at the garden below. The old pine trees were visible from her window if she stood at the right angle, just the tops of them, their branches heavy and weighted. The court adapted to winter with the efficiency of a place that had done it many times. Fires went up in every corridor. The kitchen produced different things. The schedule compressed slightly, moving more meetings to the interior rooms and fewer to the outer spaces. The mornings changed too. The garden was harder to walk in snow and ice, so the morning hours that had sometimes intersected at the old pine trees did not intersect in the same way. She saw him at court. She saw him at the meals, at the briefings, in the corridor outside the war room. She submitted work to him through Harwick and Frederick Wren, and it came back with his margin notes, angular, precise, asking the right questions, and she answered the margin notes with her own, and the documents went back and forth, and this was a form of conversation that required no proximity and yet was, she had come to understand, one of the most concentrated forms of communication she had ever been in. He was, in the margins of her work, someone who thought in angles. Not corners, he was not blunt in his thinking, not box-shaped. He approached a problem from the side, found the pressure point, applied force there. She would read a page she had written annotated in his hand and find that he had identified the precise place where her argument had the most vulnerability, the place she had glossed over because she had not wanted to slow down, and he would write in the margin, expand this, or source, or on one occasion that she had stared at for 5 minutes, "You are right. I did not want to be, verify." She would write back in her own hand, faster, looser. The margin notes of someone who thinks quick and writes quick and trusts the reader to follow, and the document would go back and he would answer. And so it went for weeks, a conversation they were having in the margins of work that was genuinely important, and that they were both genuinely invested in, and also something else. Something that lived alongside the genuine work the way the subterranean current runs alongside the visible one. She understood this. She was fairly sure he understood it too. They had not discussed it. Helena Cole found her in the back corner of the library on a snowy Tuesday and sat down without announcing herself, which was how Helena always arrived, and which Lyra had stopped finding surprising after the first month. "You are thinner," Helena said. "I am sleeping less." "Why?" Lyra looked at her. Helena Cole had spent 20 years in a military court and had developed, over those years, a face that was capable of hearing almost anything without reacting to it in a way that made the teller regret the telling. Lyra had been paying attention to this quality for 2 months and had confirmed it multiple times. "I am trying to be patient about something," she said. "I am not good at patience." Helena said nothing. "There is something I would like to do," Lyra said, "and I am trying to determine whether it would be good or bad to do it." "What kind of something?" Lyra looked at the bookshelf behind Helena's head. She thought about all the careful, intelligent arguments she had been making to herself for 8 weeks. She thought about the dream where he looked up, and the weight of it. "Something that could hurt someone if I do it wrong," she said. Helena was quiet for a moment. "Do you know how to do it right?" "I think so." She looked at her hands. "I am not certain." "What would being certain require?" Lyra considered. "More information than I have, which I could get by doing the thing which is circular." "Most significant things are circular," Helena said. "You go in without certainty and you find out. That is the mechanism." "I know." She moved her finger along the edge of the document she had been reading. "The risk is not to me." Helena was quiet for a longer moment. When she spoke, her voice was the careful voice of someone who has decided to tell a true thing even though the true thing is not simple. "Lyra, I have watched Kale rule this court for 9 years. I was here when he lost Sira. I watched him build the walls afterward, brick by brick, and I have watched those walls hold for 6 years. I have watched very competent and very well-meaning people fail to find the gap in them, not because they tried and failed, but because there was no gap. The walls were complete." Lyra said nothing. "The walls," Helena said slowly, "are not complete anymore." Lyra looked at her. "I am telling you what I observe," Helena said. "I am not advising you in one direction or the other. What you do with it is your own." She stood, smoothed her gown, and left. Lyra sat in the back corner of the library for a long time. She was crossing the inner corridor that connected the war room wing to the Great Hall on a Thursday afternoon when she almost walked into him. Not literally, there was sufficient space, but the corridor had a turn in it that she had taken slightly faster than the icy floors warranted, and he was on the other side of the turn, alone, returning from the war room, and the space between them when they both stopped was smaller than it usually was. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The analysis of the Eastern compliance structure," she said, which was a sentence she had actually been thinking about for a different reason than the one she was now using it for. "What about it?" His voice was exactly itself, composed, level, clear. "I want to add a section on the informal trade networks that don't appear in the formal documents. The ones the border families run between themselves during the winter months, outside the official agreements. They are a significant part of the actual economic picture, and they never appear in the formal analysis because they are not formally documented." He was looking at her with an expression she had catalogued and recatalogued and still could not place with complete accuracy. "Add it," he said. "I will need access to the northern trading records, the ones from before the formal agreements were established. I will have Harwick get them for you." A pause. "Anything else?" There was a great deal else which she was not going to say in a corridor. "No," she said, "that is all." He nodded and moved to pass. She said, "Kale." He stopped. She had used his name. She had not used his name before in a direct address. She had used Your Majesty, and in the war room the impersonal he, who is listening form that court advisors used when addressing a point to the room. She had never said his name to his face. He turned. I am going to add a section on the informal networks, she said. I think it will substantially change the picture the analysis presents. I want you to be prepared for that. Some of the conclusions will need to be revised. He looked at her for a moment, then revised them, he said. He walked on. She stood in the corridor and her beast, which had been patiently waiting for 8 weeks, made a sound she had not heard it make before. Not the familiar press at the seams that she had lived with her whole life. Something lower, something more like recognition. She walked to the eastern wing and sat at her desk and opened the analysis and began working. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping, and the section she added was the best work she had ever done. And she knew it was the best work she had ever done because she was producing it from the full available depth of what she knew and could do, which she only ever did when she was trying very hard. And she was trying very hard because there was someone across the palace whose margin notes had taught her to. And this was the most efficient thing about him that she had not expected and could not account for. She submitted it the next morning. The response came back in 3 hours, which was faster than anything she had submitted before. 6 pages of margin notes. And at the bottom of the last page in his angular hand, this changes the picture significantly, as you said it would. Meet with me and Harwick tomorrow, bring everything. She read it twice. Then she set it down. She went to the window that looked toward the garden, where the old pine trees were not visible from this angle but were there. She knew they were there, weighted with snow, standing over the roots that the path went around. She was going to bring everything. The meeting with Harwick and Kale lasted 3 hours, and changed a significant portion of the Eastern policy framework. She knew this because Harwick told her, after Kale had left the room, with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has watched a map he has been using for years become obsolete in a morning. The informal network analysis, he said, the king has flagged it for the full council review. It will be the primary document. Good, she said. She was organizing her papers. The formal agreements were built on incomplete data. That is not a criticism. The data was not available when they were built. It is available now. Thanks to you. She looked at him. Thanks to me being from the place the data comes from. She put the papers in order. That is what border people are for, Harwick. We know things about our territories that the administrative center cannot know from a distance. That is not special. It is just proximity. Harwick looked at her with the expression that she had come to understand meant he was filing something away for later. You are very determined to be ordinary, he said. I am very determined to be accurate, she said. They are not always the same thing. He smiled, a real smile, the one she had come to know as the sign that she had said something that landed for him. No, he agreed, they are not. She left the meeting room and walked back through the palace with its winter light and its snow-muffled sounds, and she thought about the 3 hours she had just spent in a room with Kale and Harwick, presenting her analysis, fielding questions, defending the sections that were being challenged not because they were wrong but because they changed things people were comfortable with. Kale had asked her 3 questions in those 3 hours. Each one had been the most important question in the room at the time it was asked. Each one had been the question she was expecting and had prepared for, and he had still managed to ask it in a form that reached past the preparation and required the thing behind the preparation, which was just her actual thinking without the scaffolding of the document. She had answered, directly and fully, without the hesitation that came from trying to shape an answer for an audience, just the actual answer. He had listened to each one with his complete attention, and then he had nodded, and the meeting had moved forward. This was, and she was naming it, even in the interior of herself where naming things was always the most honest act. This was one of the best kinds of conversation she had ever been in, not because it had been warm or because it had contained anything personal. Because it had been real, and because he had wanted the actual substance and not the performance of the substance, and she was a person who had spent her whole life offering substance to people who were expecting a performance and finding it slightly alarming. He was not alarmed. She walked through the winter palace and thought about this, and her beast, which had been quiet for 8 weeks, and which had made that new sound in the corridor when she said his name, was now very still again. The particular stillness of something that has come to a decision it is not announcing yet. She went to the east wing. She sat at her desk. She wrote to her father a real letter this time, longer than the others, honest in places she had kept careful in the previous letters. She told him about the analysis, about the council review, about the informal network section that was changing the framework. She told him about Helena Cole and General Cole and Harwick's 22 years of quiet competence. She told him about the palace library and the northern trading records and the way the palace adapted to winter. She did not tell him about the armory, or the margins, or the way she had said Kale's name in the corridor and felt her beast make a sound she had not heard before. But she did tell him, "I am glad I came. I did not expect to be glad. I am." She sealed the letter. Outside the east window, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear and very cold and darkening toward evening, and the palace lit its lamps one by one in the gathering dark, and from somewhere below in the garden she could hear, barely, the particular deep quiet of the old pine trees weighted with snow. She listened to it for a while. Then she turned back to her desk and opened the next set of documents and worked until the hour was too late to work in, and the night settled fully over Ironville, and the lamps burned in the corridors, and she did not dream that night of a corridor and a man looking up. She dreamed of the old pine trees, which had been standing before the palace was built, and the roots that had pushed through the stone path, and the decision that had been made, a very long time ago, to go around rather than through. She woke with the specific clarity that sometimes comes from dreams that are less like images and more like conclusions. She lay in the dark for a few minutes. Then she got up, because the morning was coming and she had work to do, and because whatever was building toward its conclusion was building in its own time, and she had decided, going to trust the timing. Her beast was quiet and sure, and she was going to trust that too. The threat on her life arrived on a Wednesday, which she would later note was the day she had begun to associate with disruption to expected patterns. It was not announced, threats rarely are. She was in the Great Hall in the late afternoon, reviewing a set of border ledgers she had requested from the archives, using one of the long side tables because the library was occupied. The Great Hall was mostly empty at this hour, between the afternoon briefings and the evening meal, in the gap that the court used for dressing, personal meetings, and the kinds of preparations that occupied people with more elaborate daily requirements than she had. She was making a note in the margin of the ledger when she heard the side door open. Two men she did not recognize. This was the first signal. In 2 months at Ironville, she had learned the household staff at a level of detail that Harwick had noted once, with mild disbelief, exceeded what most people who had lived there for years managed. She knew the guards by rotation. She knew the kitchen staff by shift. She knew the advisors and their assistants and their assistants' assistants. These two men were not in any category she had filed. She did not react. She closed the ledger and placed it flat on the table and appeared to continue reading it. The second signal was the door. It had not been left open. That was corridor staff behavior, someone coming through quickly, leaving it to close on its own. These two men had eased the door closed behind them, which was the behavior of someone managing sound. She assessed the room in the 3 seconds she had available. The main entrance was across the hall, 30 feet away. The side door they had come through was behind her. There was a servant's passage behind the far tapestry. She knew this because she had mapped every servant's passage in the palace in the 5th week, which was 20 feet to her left. She stood up and moved toward the tapestry at the exact normal pace of someone who has finished with a document and is leaving. She heard them move. She stopped pretending and ran. The servant's passage was narrow and dark, and she had only been through it twice, but she had a good internal map, and her internal map held. Right turn, left turn, the staircase going up, the second door on the landing. She pushed through into the upper corridor and was already moving toward the main section of the palace, toward the sound of people and guards and structure. What she had not accounted for was the third person. He was already in the upper corridor, broad, quick, positioned between her and the main section. He had been placed there, which meant this was organized, which meant she was in a situation that was substantially more serious than two men in a great hall. She stopped. He moved toward her. She was calculating distance to the nearest guard station, which was the north checkpoint, 40 feet and a corner, too far and too unknown for a race, when the door behind him opened. Kale came through it at a speed she had never seen from him. Later she would understand that he had been in the inner corridor on the other side of the north checkpoint, returning from a late meeting. Later she would understand that a guard had raised the alarm through the internal signal system the moment the two men had been flagged entering the Great Hall without clearance. At the time, in the moment, She registered none of the mechanism. She registered only the fact of him arriving on the other side of a large man who intended her harm, and the fact of what happened to him when he arrived. She had felt it once before, in the corridor outside the war room, the thing beneath the composure, the thing that had moved when she touched his wrist. She had felt it as vibration, as depth, as the sense of something enormous at a great distance. What moved through the upper corridor now was not at a distance. The beast that had been silent for 6 years did not ask permission. It did not present itself with the gradual emergence that a controlled alpha uses when shifting. It arrived, all at once, like a wall of weather, like the first second of a storm, the pressure dropping, the air changing, the quality of the light in the corridor shifting in a way that was not about the lamps. The man between them went still. He was large and he was capable, and he had come here with a plan, and in the face of what was now in the corridor with him, his plan became irrelevant. The beast of an alpha king, unchained after 6 years, was not a thing that plans survived. Cale did not speak. He did not need to. The beast spoke instead, in the language that bypassed words entirely, the language that every living thing with any instinct for survival can understand without translation. The man stepped back. He stepped back 3 steps and then he stopped because there was a wall behind him. Then he did something Lyra had not expected. He ran, sideways through the door that she had come through and down the servants' passage fast and without looking back. She found out later that he had gone into the passage and directly into the arms of the 2 guards coming up from the great hall, which was the last piece of the situation organizing itself. In the corridor, in the moment, she stood and looked at Cale. He was 5 feet from her. The beast was still present, not receded, not managed, present. She could feel it the way she had felt it in the corridor outside the war room, but enormously amplified. There was no distance between her and it. It was right here, filling the air of the upper corridor, and it was looking at her. Not with aggression. The aggression had been for the man between them. This was something different. She met him without moving, without looking away, and held the contact the way she held everything she was not sure of, with her feet planted and her eyes open. His face was, she would not be able to describe this afterward in any language that adequately captured it. The composure was gone, not destroyed. Set down, deliberately, the way you set down something you have been carrying when you finally arrive somewhere it does not need to be carried. He looked at her. He was 2 breaths from something. Then the guard from the north checkpoint came around the corner, and the palace machinery arrived in force, guards, Harwick behind them, the sound of more people coming, and the moment changed its shape. Cale stepped back 1 step. The beast did not leave. It was still there. She could feel it, but it moved back from the front of him, and the composed face returned, and he turned to the guard and said something in a voice she could not hear because her heart was very loud. She stood in the corridor and waited for her hands to be steady, and they were not steady for a while. Harwick took her to a secure sitting room while the guards worked. He brought her tea, which she held and did not drink, and he sat across from her with the face of a man doing 17 things in his head while maintaining the appearance of only doing 1. The 2 men in the great hall are from the Delvin Western faction, he said. This is preliminary. We will know more within the hour. The Delvin, she said, not Ironville enemies. They were sent to discourage you, he said carefully. Your analysis of the Eastern informal networks has identified several Delvin-controlled routes that were operating without the Pack Council's awareness. That information has reached parties who find your continued presence and productivity at Ironville inconvenient. She absorbed this. Someone told the Delvin faction what I was working on. We are investigating. She set down the tea. I am a border ward who contributed analysis. If they find my presence inconvenient enough to send people here. It means your work was more significant than border ward analysis, Harwick said. He said it simply and directly and with the tone of a man who is done with the understatement that has been in use up to this point. You have been producing intelligence-level work for 8 weeks, Lyra. The Eastern Compliance Framework, the Informal Network Section, the Stream Migration Correction, these are not ward contributions. These are council-level contributions. She looked at him. The king has known this, Harwick said. I would appreciate it if you did not ask me to speak for him beyond that. She looked at her hands, steady now mostly. Is this going to happen again? Not without significant consequences for whoever sends them. He said it with a flatness that told her the significant consequences had already been identified and were waiting to be deployed. You will have a personal guard assignment beginning tonight. I do not need. It is not negotiable, Harwick said. He said it kindly, which was worse. It is also not optional. She did not argue. She recognized the point past which argument was not productive, and this was that point. Is the king all right? She said. Harwick looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise, but something that had surprise in it, quickly replaced by the careful neutrality of a man managing information. Yes, he said. He is attending to the aftermath. His beast, she stopped. Harwick was very quiet. It was not quiet, she said. No, Harwick said, it was not. She looked at the window, which showed a dark and cold evening. The snowfall returned and heavier now. She thought about 6 years of silence and what it had taken to break the silence, and what the breaking of it had felt like from 5 feet away. I need to see him, she said. Miss Aldenmore. I am not asking for access to the king, she said. I am telling you that I need to see him, and I am telling you this because you are the appropriate person to communicate it. She looked at Harwick steadily. I think he needs to know that I am all right. Harwick looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then he stood. Give me a few minutes, he said. He left. She sat in the secure sitting room and drank the tea, which had gone cold, and waited. And outside the window the snow fell on Ironville with the clean, heavy patience of a winter that had a great deal still to say. Harwick came back in 11 minutes. She knew because she had counted. The king will see you, he said. He paused, in the study. She stood, set down the cold tea, and followed him. The palace was in a kind of organized urgency, guards at double positions, the household staff moving in the careful, efficient way of people who have been given specific tasks and are performing them. She walked through it with Harwick and said nothing. The study door was closed. Harwick knocked and opened it and stepped back. She went in. Cale was at the north-facing window. He was looking at the dark and the falling snow, and his back was to the door, and he did not turn immediately. She came in and stood near the desk and waited. He turned. She had seen his face without the wall in the armory. She had seen the composed face in 100 court moments. She had seen in the upper corridor the face when the wall was removed by something faster and more powerful than the man who maintained it. This was a fourth face. He had come back, the composure was in place, but it had been put back quickly and it was not fully settled, and she could see the joins where it had not had time to smooth, and she thought, with the completeness of certainty that she trusted about herself, that he had not let anyone else see the joins. You are not injured, he said. It was the first thing. It was a statement, but the tone was a question. He was checking it against the evidence of her standing in his study. A bruised shoulder from the passage wall, she said, nothing else. He nodded. He was looking at her with his whole attention, which was saying something she could not quite hear through the rest of it. Your beast, she said, it came back. His jaw tightened, not the small fraction she had learned to read as internal emergency. More, it was not, he stopped. I did not direct it. I know, she said, it chose. He looked at her. The joins in the composure were visible, and she did not pretend they weren't. In 6 years, he said carefully, it has not once, not in any situation. The border skirmishes, the succession challenge in the 2nd year, the alliance breakdown 3 years ago, not once. I know, she said again. He was quiet. Then, are you afraid of it? She thought about the upper corridor, the pressure drop, the air changing. The quality of the beast's attention when it had looked at her with something that was not aggression, but was enormous. No, she said. He looked at her the way he had looked at the map in the war room, the first time she had pointed to something and been right, as if he was recalculating the variables, and finding that the calculation was coming out differently than he had planned for. You should be, he said. It was not a warning. It was more like something he had said before, maybe to himself, maybe to no one, and that he was testing against the fact of her standing here not afraid. I am a border pack person, she said. I have been around the edges of things my whole life. I know what a beast looks like when it is choosing versus when it is not controlled. She held his gaze. Yours was choosing, specifically and completely and with full intent. She paused. It chose to protect someone. That is not a frightening thing. That is exactly what a beast is supposed to do. The silence in the study held them both. His face shifted. It shifted the way it had shifted in the armory, not a dissolution, but a settling. Like something that has been braced against pressure, finding that the pressure has lifted, and not quite knowing yet how to occupy the space that was being held for the pressure. "Sit down," he said. He said it quietly. Not a king's instruction, something more like a person who is asking because they need the room to be occupied differently than it is. She sat. He sat not behind the desk, but in the chair across from it, which was the chair she had never seen him in, because he was always at the desk. They sat in the study with the dark and the snow outside the north window. "I did not know it would come back," he said. "I had, after enough time, I had stopped expecting it would." She said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing when nothing was right. "It is not what I plan to discuss with you today," he said. The ghost of something moved through his expression. It might, in a different context, in a different man, have been the very beginning of something like dry humor. The afternoon took an unexpected direction. "It did," she said. He looked at the north window. The snow was settling heavily on the palace grounds. "Are you going to continue staying at Ironville?" She looked at him. He was asking with his eyes on the window and his voice in its careful register, and she could hear, behind both the window-looking and the careful voice, the thing he was actually asking. "Yes," she said. He turned from the window. He looked at her and she looked back, and the joins in the composure were still visible, and she did not look away from them because looking away from them would have been the wrong thing, and she was done doing the wrong thing out of caution when the right thing was available. "Good," he said. It was the same word he had used in the study the first time when she had said she would stay as long as she was needed. The same word, different weight. She stayed in the study for another hour. They talked about the Delving faction and the likely intelligence leak and the guard assignment, and they talked about the policy framework and what the next review would need to cover. They talked about ordinary court things in a study at night with the snow outside and the North Mountain view that existed, because someone had chosen a window for the view rather than the light. And by the end of the hour the composure was back and smooth and complete, and she had stopped being able to see the joins. But she had seen them. She went back to the east wing, with the guard Harwick had assigned walking a correct and unobtrusive 3 steps behind her, and she went to bed and slept the full night for the first time in weeks. Her beast was not waiting anymore. It was settled, the way something settles when it has arrived where it was going. She could feel the difference in herself, like the difference between a door held slightly open against a wind and a door that has been closed and latched and is simply a door now, quiet on its hinges. She lay in the dark and let herself know what she knew. She was going to tell him, not tonight, not tomorrow, when the moment was right, not because she was waiting for permission, but because she was not going to deliver something important into the wrong moment and waste it. She had her father's patience for this. She had not known she had it until now. She closed her eyes and the snow fell outside, and somewhere across the palace, a king sat in a study with a north-facing window and perhaps looked at the snow and perhaps did not, and the beast that had been silent for 6 years was not silent anymore. She slept. The morning after the upper corridor, the court treated her differently. She noticed it at breakfast. The advisors acknowledged her with a fractionally more direct kind of attention. The court ladies, who had been warming toward her for weeks in the careful incremental way of people who are reassessing a first impression, tipped a little further in the same direction. General Cole, who had always been direct with her about practical matters, nodded at her across the table, with the specific nod of a soldier acknowledging someone who has been in a situation. She had been in a situation. The court had its own economy of status, and status in this economy was not entirely about rank or birth or even about intelligence. Some of it was about what you did when the situation changed without warning. She had not panicked. She had not frozen. She had moved through the servants' passage and positioned herself and held her ground in the upper corridor. And by the time Cale had arrived, the situation had been about 3 seconds from resolving differently, and anyone in the palace who understood these things understood that. Frederick Wren, who did not usually venture opinions about things he had not been asked to consider, said to her over the tea service, "We are very glad you are all right, Miss Aldenmore." She looked at him. His face was genuine, no court formula in it. "Thank you, Frederick," she said. She was all right. She was also in a state of controlled alertness that she recognized from her years on the Aldenmore border, the state that came after something had nearly happened and had not, and your body had not yet fully processed that the something was no longer occurring. She knew from experience that this state was useful for approximately 12 hours, during which your attention was sharper than usual and your reactions were faster, and that after the 12 hours you needed to sleep for a long time. She planned to use the 12 hours. Cale received her in the war room at the 3rd hour. Harwick was present and Cole and 2 senior guards. The investigation into the intelligence leak was already underway. The Delvin faction's involvement was being communicated to the Pack Council through diplomatic channels, which was Ironville's way of doing things that were, in another kind of kingdom, done with blunter instruments. She presented the section of her analysis that identified the Delvin-controlled routes, clearly and in the correct order, and answered the questions the senior guards had about timing and sourcing. She was thorough. She was useful. She was watching at a level below the thoroughness and usefulness the way Cale moved through the meeting. The composure was complete and exact. The beast was present, she could feel it, low and consistent like a deep sound at the edge of hearing, but it was not pressing. It was simply there the way it was supposed to be, alongside him, not separate from him, not chained. He looked at her once, during a question about the Millhaven route, a question she was answering and that he was listening to, and the look lasted exactly 2 seconds and contained, in those 2 seconds, something she filed with the precision of someone who does not want to lose it. She filed it and continued answering the question. After the meeting, he stopped her in the corridor. "The personal guard assignment," he said. "I am aware Harwick has arranged it. It will remain in place until the council concludes the investigation." He paused. "This is not because I question your ability to manage yourself." "I know," she said. "It is because the Delvin faction is organized and has already made one error here, and organizations that make one organized error are considering whether to make a second one." "I know that too." He looked at her. "You are not going to argue about the guard." "No." A brief pause. "That is unlike you." She almost smiled. "Not quite. I am choosing my arguments." He looked at her for a moment. "The corridor, last evening, I want to—" He stopped, started again more carefully. "You said you were not afraid." "I was not. Most people would be." "I am not most people." She held his gaze. "And your beast was not aimed at me." Something shifted in his expression. "No," he said, "it was not." She waited for the rest of the sentence. There was not a rest of the sentence, which told her that the rest of the sentence existed and was being managed by the same composure that managed everything else. "I will let you know when the Delvin investigation produces results relevant to your work," he said. "Thank you." He walked away. She watched the shape of his back going down the corridor, the particular held quality of it, the way he moved as if he owned the space without displaying the ownership, and she thought about the fact that his beast was present again after 6 years, walking alongside him, and that something very careful and very patient was in the process of becoming something else. She gave Helena Cole the factual account of the upper corridor over tea that afternoon. Not the underneath of it, not the way the beast had felt, or what she had seen in his face in the study afterward. The facts, the servant's passage, the third man, the alarm, the resolution. Helena listened without interrupting, which she was capable of when the information required it. "And you are well," Helena said when she had finished. "I am well. And the king?" Lara looked at her tea. "His beast came back." The silence that followed this was the most specific silence she had shared with Helena, who was a woman capable of communicating a great deal with the quality of her quiet. This silence said, "I know what this means." It says, "I am choosing how to respond carefully." It said, "This is the thing I told you about in the library, the walls, the gap." "When he came through the door," Helena said slowly, "what did it feel like?" Lyra considered whether to answer this. She decided she was going to answer it because it was Helena, and because not answering it was the kind of caution that did not serve the conversation. "Like the weather changing," she said. "Like the first second of a storm, but not aimed at me." Helena looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said, "it would not be." She said it with the tone of someone who has been watching a long story move toward its conclusion, and is relieved to see the thing finally turning. "Helena," Lyra said. "Yes, I am going to say something to him. Helena set down her cup very precisely when it is right. She looked at her hands. I am not going to rush it. The timing matters. What are you going to say? Lyra looked at the window. The snow had stopped. The afternoon was clear and cold. Something true, she said. I am going to say something true and then stop talking. Helena was quiet. Then, that is probably the correct approach for this particular person. I think so. Less is more with him. Significantly. Helena poured more tea, which neither of them needed. I have waited 9 years to see him look at someone the way he has been looking at you for the past 3 weeks, she said. She said it without sentimentality, in the same tone she used for military assessments and court logistics. I am aware that sounds like an exaggeration. It is not. Lyra said nothing. He does not look at people, Helena said. He observes people, he assesses people, he manages people. He has not looked at anyone the way you look at someone when someone has reached a place inside you that you are not offering access to. She paused. Until you. Lyra held the warm cup in both hands. That is both the most useful and the most alarming thing you have told me. I thought you should know, Helena said. They sat with the winter light and the cold clear sky outside, and said nothing more about it and finished their tea. She found the right moment on a Saturday. Not planned in the specific sense, she had not designed the timing. But when it arrived, she recognized it, the way you recognize something you have been watching for, clearly and without hesitation. She had been in the garden in the early afternoon. The snow was packed and dry underfoot, the kind of cold that was sharp rather than oppressive, and the old pine trees were bare at the branches now, the snow having slid from them in the week since the heavy fall. She heard him on the path before she saw him. His steps were distinctive, the particular weight of them on packed snow, the even pace that did not change with weather or circumstance. He came around the curve of the path and stopped when he saw her. She looked at him, he looked at her. They were among the old pine trees where they had first spoken on the second morning of her time at Ironville, and the light was the same early afternoon winter light, cold and clear. I come here most days, she said, not every day. But most. I know, he said. She looked at the largest pine, the one with bark so thick and ridged it looked like a different material entirely. Helena told me something. I want you to know that I am not telling you this because I want you to manage it. I am telling you because I think it is accurate and I thought you should know it from me directly. He said nothing. He was listening with the complete attention she had come to know. She said that in 9 years she has not seen you look at anyone the way you look at me. She kept her voice even and her eyes on the tree. I did not ask her to tell me this. She decided I should know. She paused. She is usually right about things. The garden was very quiet. She turned from the tree and looked at him. His face was not the composure, not the wall, not the armory face or the upper corridor face or the study face. Something she had not seen before, which was what happened when a person let you see the part of them that is in the process of deciding something, the moment before the decision resolves. She is usually right, he said. Lyra stood in the garden and held very still. Her beast, which had been settled and quiet for days, was alert now, fully, completely alert and still. I know I am a ward here, she said. I know the territory. She kept her voice steady. I am not pretending the situation is something it is not. I am only telling you what I think is true, because I am a person who cannot be in possession of a truth and choose not to say it. I know, he said, quietly, something moved in his expression. I have noticed this about you from the beginning. It is inconvenient. It is the least inconvenient thing about you, he said. And there it was, the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth that she had catalogued and wondered about for weeks, resolved now into the actual thing, not a ghost at all, brief and real. She let out a slow breath. He looked at her in the winter light among the old pine trees, and she looked back, and the beast in him was present and warm at the edges of the air between them, and her own beast was very still, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the moment held everything it needed to. He said her name. Lyra. Not addressed to her the way a king addresses a ward, not addressed to her the way a court official addresses a useful resource. Her name the way you say someone's name when the name has become something you carry. She stood very still. I have been, he stopped. He was, she realized, working against the constraint of 6 years of careful composure, not the composure itself, but the habit of it, the habit of framing everything in the language of management and administration, because that language had been the only one available for a long time. He started again. I have been aware of you in a way that I have not managed to account for. She waited. From the beginning, he said, from the formal presentation, you did not look away. He paused. Most people look away. I know. It did not seem to require anything from you, he said. Not effort, not performance. You were simply present in a room fully, in every room. I have been told this is sometimes too much, she said. It is not too much, he said. The precision in his voice was the same precision he used for everything, for border intelligence, for policy analysis, for the margin notes in her documents. It is exactly the right amount. She felt something shift in her chest, not the knife feeling from the armory, not the unsettled alertness of the corridor. Something cleaner, something that was simply the sensation of being exactly seen. He had not moved closer. He was still on the other side of the winter garden path among the old pine trees, and the cold light moved between them without disturbance. He was looking at her with his whole face available, not the wall, not the composure, and not the raw urgency of the corridor. Just him in the garden with his beast present and warm and choosing. You came here, he said, and you did not try to be something for the court. You were not performing Ironville for me or for Harwick or for anyone. You were just yourself, which is, he paused. I had forgotten that people could do that. I had stopped expecting it. I do not know how to perform, she said honestly. I have tried, I am bad at it. Something crossed his face that was, she was now certain, the actual version of the thing she had seen glimpses of for weeks, real and unguarded and very brief, gone back into the composure before it fully formed, but she caught it. She looked at him and understood that this was not a moment for more words. She had said what she came to say. He had said what he was able to say, which was, for Cale, an extraordinary amount. The moment did not need more language in it. The moment was complete. She let it be complete. The garden held its cold, clear silence, and the old pine trees stood in it, the way they had been standing for several hundred years, before the palace, before the path, before the complicated and specific business of people working out how to reach each other across the distances they build for good reasons. I have work this afternoon, she said. He nodded. The Northern Records Review. Yes, she turned to go, then stopped. Cale. He looked at her. Your beast has been present since the corridor, she said. She said it simply as an observation, not loaded with anything more than the fact of it. You should know that it is good. To have it back. He said nothing for a moment, then, yes. She walked back toward the palace. She did not look back, she did not need to. She went to the east wing and sat at her desk and opened the Northern Records and began working, and the afternoon light moved across the desk, and something that had been building for 9 weeks, in her, in him, in the space between two people who had both gotten very good at carrying things alone, had arrived at the place where carrying alone was no longer the only option. She worked until evening, she worked well. The Northern Records were detailed and complex, and she moved through them with full attention, and at the end of the afternoon she had 3 pages of notes that were going to be useful and accurate, and that she was looking forward to putting in front of him tomorrow. She was looking forward to tomorrow. She paused on this for a moment, pen in hand, and noticed it with the same honesty she tried to apply to everything. She was looking forward to tomorrow, to the war room and the briefing and the margin notes going back and forth, and the precise, angular questions that found the pressure points in her thinking and made the work better. She was, she thought, going to be very good at this. At dinner she sat in her usual place and ate her soup and participated in the conversation around her, and down the length of the long table Cale sat at the head and attended to the court. Once, near the end of the first course, he looked down the table and met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. It was the same 2 seconds they had always used, the same duration, the same contact. Different content. She looked away and finished her soup and told herself to be patient for just a little while longer, because the right moment was not yet, but it was coming, and patience was a thing she had been learning, and she was going to trust what she had learned. Her beast lay quiet and warm in the settled center of her, and agreed. Thank you. She chose a Sunday, because Sunday was the day the court ran at half pace. Not by schedule exactly. There was no formal declaration that Sunday was a lighter day. It was simply what it was, the day when the briefings were fewer and the war room was quiet and the palace exhaled slightly, the way a person exhales on the seventh day of the week, not from custom but from something more animal than that. She woke before dawn. She lay in the wide east wing bed and listened to the palace around her and was completely clear about what she was going to do, which was not the same as being completely sure how it was going to go. These were different things. She was clear. She was not certain. She got up. She dressed in the warmest thing she had, because the garden in winter before sunrise was not a place for hesitation about layers. She braided her hair without looking in the glass, because she was not in the mood for how she looked, but only for the fact of being ready to go somewhere. She went to the garden. The old pine trees were dark shapes in the very last of the pre-dawn dark, and the sky above them was just beginning the specific shift from black to the deep blue that comes before the gray that comes before the light. Her breath made small clouds. Her boots made the particular crunch of very cold snow. She stood at the edge of the old pines and waited. She had been waiting for 9 weeks, in the technical sense. Another few minutes was not the difficult part. She heard his steps on the path. He came around the curve the way he always came, the same pace, the same quality of presence, unhurried in the particular way of someone who has made their peace with the pace required. He stopped when he saw her. She had expected this. She had not expected the particular quality of his stopping, which was not surprise exactly, but something more like a person arriving at a destination they had known they were approaching, and not quite being prepared for the fact of having arrived. She looked at him, he looked at her. The sky above the pine trees was moving from deep blue toward the first faint line of the light that was going to arrive whether or not anyone was ready for it. She crossed the distance between them. She had not fully planned what she was going to do. This was unlike her in a technical sense. She was a person who planned, who prepared, who came to border negotiations knowing her positions and her fallbacks and the specific weights of each. But there was a category of things that planning could not fully hold, and she was standing in the middle of one, and she trusted herself to know what to do with it. She stopped in front of him, close, closer than the distance they kept in corridors and war rooms and gardens not at dawn. She put her hand flat against his chest. Not the wrist, not to stop him from walking away, not an accident, not a mistake, not a reaching for something else. Her hand palm flat against the front of him in the place where the beast lived. He went completely still. Not the cold stillness of the composure, not the stillness of management, the stillness of something that has been asked a question it has been waiting a very long time for. She held it there, her hand on his chest, her eyes on his face, in the pre-dawn dark of the garden with the old pine trees around them. And the beast that had been chained for 6 years, the beast that had spoken once in the upper corridor to protect her, the beast that had walked alongside him for these weeks since, warm and present and waiting, leaned into her hand. She felt it before she understood it. A pressure from inside him, a warmth that was not body temperature but something deeper than that, a vibration that traveled up through her palm and into her wrist and her arm, and settled in the center of her chest with a weight that was not heavy but solid, like something finding a place it was looking for. She understood then what she had felt in the corridor outside the war room, the first time she had touched his wrist and the world had gone still. She had felt the edge of it then, the near edge, through the wall and the distance and the 6 years. She was feeling it fully now, and it was the most startling thing she had ever experienced, and she had walked border territories at night and been in the upper corridor with armed men, and none of that had prepared her for this. It was recognition, not hers recognizing his, both of them recognizing something that was neither of them individually, but that existed in the space where they were both present. She looked up at him. His face was the fourth face, the one she had seen in the study the night of the upper corridor, the one where the joins were visible, where the composure had been set down. But this was more than that. This was the joins fully open. This was the thing behind the wall not peeking through but simply standing where it was, visible, present, making no attempt to hide. She kept her hand where it was. He raised his hand and placed it over hers. His hand over her hand over his chest, the beast warm and present underneath both of them. They stood like this. The sky continued its movement from blue to gray to the first thin light of morning, and the pine trees stood around them with their several 100-years-old patience, and the palace behind them had not yet woken to its day, and they were in the garden in the early morning with nothing between them and the fact of what was true. He did not speak, she did not speak. Language was not the instrument for this. After a while, she did not know how long, he exhaled. Slowly, completely, the way you exhale when you have been holding something for a very long time, and you finally set it down in a place that will hold it. She felt it move through him. She felt the beast feel it too. When she finally lifted her hand and he lowered his, the sky was fully gray and the morning had arrived. They stood in the cold light and looked at each other, and it was different than all the other times they had looked at each other, which had been many, in corridors and war rooms and dining rooms and studies. This was the look that happens after the most important sentence has been said, without words, with the specific kind of saying that is more accurate than words. "Are you all right?" she said. It was a simple question and she asked it simply. He looked at her for a moment, as if he was taking careful account of what all right meant now, in this moment, with the beast present and warm and freely walking for the first time in 6 years. "Yes," he said. He said it with the precision he used for things he was certain of. "Yes, I am." She nodded. "Lyra," he said her name again, the way he had said it in the garden the previous week, carrying it. "I need you to know that I am not going to rush past this. I am not going to treat it as something simpler than it is." "I know," she said. "It is what it is. I am aware of what it is." She looked at him steadily. "I know what it is too," she said. "I have known for several weeks." "I know you have," he said, and there was the ghost again at the corner of his mouth, resolving this time into something small and real. "You know most things before I am ready to say them." "It is occasionally inconvenient," she said. "It is never inconvenient," he said. They stood in the cold morning. She thought about 9 weeks. About the formal presentation and the wrong curtsy and the corridor and the war room and the armory at midnight. About the margin notes going back and forth in angular and quick loose script. About the Wednesday dining room and the name with no epitaph and the old pine trees planted in a month of grief. About the upper corridor and the study and the garden yesterday and the look on his face when she had said something true and stopped talking. She thought about a beast that had been chained for 6 years and what it had felt like when it leaned into her hand. "The path goes around the roots," she said. He looked at her. Not through them, the plans were moved to accommodate the trees. She looked at the largest pine, the ancient one. "I thought about that for a long time after you told me." He followed her gaze to the tree. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him with the specific sense she had developed for him, the weather sense, the current in the room sense, and what she felt in him was something unclenching. Very slowly. The way ice unclenches when the temperature changes not all at once but incrementally and then more quickly and then completely. "Yes," he said. They walked back toward the palace together. Side by side, not touching, which was right for the moment. The moment did not need more than it had already held, and she was a person who believed in not exceeding the weight a moment could bear. But they walked together. In the warmth of the palace entrance, where the morning staff was beginning the breakfast preparations, and the smell of the kitchen was coming through from below, and the lamps were still lit against the gray morning light, he stopped. "You said," he said, "that the path goes around the roots, not through them." "Yes." He looked at her. "I would like to go around," he said. "For once, not through, not past, not organized to avoid." He paused. "Around, with someone else doing the going around." She understood what he was saying. She understood every layer of what he was saying, and she held all of them at once, and she said, "Yes, all right." He nodded. Then he walked toward the inner corridor and the morning's obligations, and she went to the east wing to get her coat because it was cold and she was going to need it. And the palace moved around both of them with its ordinary morning efficiency, and somewhere in the distance, the kitchen bell rang for the first meal of the day. She stood in her room for a moment, coat in hand, and felt the beast in her settled and warm and certain, and looked at the east-facing window where the first full light of morning was now coming in, clean and cold and clear. She put on her coat. She went to breakfast. Helena Cole found her at the sideboard, which was where Lyra usually stood at breakfast when she was doing 3 things at once and needed to keep moving. "You look different," Helena said. "I am the same." "You look different," Helena said again, with the particular tone of someone who is not offering this as an argument but as a data point. Lyra picked up her tea and a roll and turned away from the sideboard. "The day is clear," she said, "after all the snow." Helena looked at her for one more moment, And then she smiled, the actual smile, not the court smile, the one that had warmth all the way through it. She said nothing. She went to find her seat. General Cole arrived at breakfast a few minutes after, with the energy of a man who had already been doing things for 2 hours, which was how Cole always arrived at breakfast. He sat down and accepted tea from Frederick Wren, and looked at the table with the expression of a man reviewing his morning schedule. He looked at Lyra, then at the head of the table, then back at Lyra. He said, "Good morning, Miss Aldenmore." "Good morning, General." He picked up his tea. He did not say anything else. But Helena, sitting next to him, reached over and moved the salt dish slightly to the left, which was something she only did when she was extremely pleased about something and had decided that the salt dish deserved a better position. Cale came in at the second hour, which was his usual time, and sat at the head of the table, and the court morning began its assembly around him. He attended to the room the way he always attended to it, with the full administrative competence that ran like clockwork, and he did not look at her any differently than he had looked at her yesterday, and also completely differently. She ate her roll and drank her tea, and listened to Frederick Wren describe the day's schedule, and thought about the way the beast in him felt now when she was near it, warm, present, choosing. The way a fire feels when it is burning freely in a room it belongs in, not behind glass or under a lid but open to the air, giving its heat freely. She thought about what Helena had said. "I have waited 9 years to see him look at someone that way." 9 years, she had been at Ironville for 9 weeks. She was aware of what this said, and she was not going to make it smaller by being overly cautious about it. She was also not going to make it larger than it was, because they were at the beginning of a thing and not the end of it, and the beginning required care. She knew how to be careful. She had been careful with borders her entire life. The difference was, she had also learned to recognize when the border was not a wall but a threshold, and she had learned that thresholds were for crossing. After breakfast, the day organized itself with its ordinary machinery. There were documents. There was a review session with Harwick about the Delving investigation progress. There was a set of Northern records she was halfway through. There was work, the specific and important work that had been her function here and that was becoming, by the week, more central to the court's understanding of its own Eastern policy. She did the work. She was thorough and precise and fully present in every meeting. And something was different, in the specific way that things are different when you are doing the same actions you have always done but with a different interior. She was not lighter exactly. She was not relieved exactly. She was something she did not have a single word for, which was the intersection of clarity and purpose, and the particular warmth that comes from having said a true thing in the right moment and had it received. He walked past her door at the 4th hour and stopped. She looked up from the Northern records. He leaned against the door frame, not entering, just present. "The Pack Council investigation is concluded," he said. "The intelligence leak was traced. It has been managed." "Good," she said. "The guard assignment will continue for another 2 weeks as a precaution." "That is reasonable." He looked at her for a moment. "Your Northern records review, is it useful?" "Very. The informal networks go back further than the formal agreements by almost 30 years. The economic picture before the agreements is, it changes the analysis of why some of the current structures are unstable." She paused. "I want to present it when it is complete." "Not in parts." "When will it be complete?" "End of the week, if I am not interrupted." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Then I will ensure you are not interrupted." "Thank you." He looked at her 2 seconds, the same duration, different world. "Lyra." "Yes." "The weekly dinner on Thursday, the formal one." He said it with the precision of a man choosing language carefully. "There is a chair to my left that has been unoccupied for 6 years, if you would be willing." The court formal dinner, to his left, which was, in the explicit hierarchy of an Ironville court dinner, the position held by the person the king considered most significant in the room. She held this information for a moment with the care it deserved. "I would," she said. He nodded. He left. She sat at her writing desk in the East Wing room with the morning light still in the window and the Northern records under her hands, and she did not look out the window or think about Thursday dinner or any of the enormous and specific things that had happened in the last 24 hours. She worked. She worked until the light changed, and then she kept working, and her beast sat warm and quiet in the center of her and was content, And outside the palace the winter day was clear and cold, and the old pine trees stood in the garden and did not need to be told anything, because they had been here long enough to understand that what mattered was not the event but what came after it, and what came after it was the day and the day after that. And the slow, careful work of two people going around something together instead of through it. She wrote until she had to light the lamp. Then she went on writing. The court noticed. Of course the court noticed. That was what courts were for, the observation and the categorization and the filing of information into the correct social and political registers. Ironville was better at it than most, because Kale ran a court that rewarded competence and intelligence, which meant the people in it were, on balance, more perceptive than average. What they noticed, the chair to the king's left, occupied at Thursday dinner for the first time in 6 years. The guard assignment that continued past its announced 2-week period, which communicated to those who understood the communication that the person being guarded was worth the ongoing resource. The fact that the margin-noted documents flowing between the king's study and the east wing room had increased in frequency and decreased in their transit time, which Frederick Wren had mentioned to no one, but which people had observed because documents moving faster meant the occupants of both ends were paying attention. What they did not notice, because they were not Harwick or Helena Cole, who had each noticed in their own way and had said very little about it, the particular quality of the air in rooms where both of them were present, the change in the texture of the composure on Cale's face, which was not less composed but was composed in a different way, like the difference between a wall that is holding something out and a wall that is simply a wall. The change in Lyra's particular quality of alertness, still fully present, still tracking the room, but the alertness was grounded now in a way it had not been before, the way a compass is more useful once it has found its north. These things the court did not have language for exactly. They had feeling. The court had feeling for them, the way you have feeling for weather, not always able to say precisely what is happening in the sky, but knowing that something has shifted. 3 weeks after the Sunday morning in the garden, the Pack Council sent formal delegation. 7 representatives, which was large, official carriages with the council colors. A letter of intent that had been drafted with the particular care of a document that is simultaneously apologizing for something and requesting a favor, which is a difficult tone to maintain over 3 pages. Lyra read the letter in the war room alongside Cale and Harwick and Cole, and the Delving faction's formal withdrawal of the intelligence operation was in the 3rd paragraph, offered in language so precisely calibrated it had taken someone several days to draft. They want concessions on the Eastern toll structure, Cole said. They do not get concessions, Cale said. The toll structure is not in discussion. They will argue that the Pack territories most affected by the Delving operation were also the territories most affected by the current toll rates. The toll structure is not in discussion, Cale said again, quiet, complete. The voice that ended that particular avenue. He turned to Lyra, the informal network analysis. Yes, she said, if they are going to negotiate the Eastern framework, they need to do it with complete information, the formal structure and the informal networks together, not one without the other. Can you present the full analysis at the delegation meeting? Yes, sir. Cole looked at her. He had the expression she had come to recognize in him, the soldier's assessment face, the one that evaluated a person for their function in a situation. You will be presenting to the council representatives who authorized the action against you. She met his eyes. I know. You are comfortable with this. I am, she said. They authorized it because my work was inconvenient to them. Presenting my work to them directly is the most accurate response available. Cole looked at Cale. Something passed between them, the shorthand of 2 men who have worked together for years. Then Cole nodded. The delegation was scheduled for 5 days out. She went back to her desk and organized the analysis with the completeness it deserved, which was considerable. She worked for 3 days. She slept better than she had in weeks. She ate her meals and attended the briefings and walked the garden in the mornings, and did the ordinary things of a life that was becoming more ordinary and more specific at the same time. More specific in the way that things become specific when they take place in a context that has begun to feel, carefully and without rushing it, like home. The delegation arrived on a Thursday, which meant the formal dinner happened on the same evening, which was either very good planning by someone or a coincidence that served the same function. She wore deep blue again, the same gown she had worn on the first evening. She had not done this consciously. She had opened the wardrobe and reached for it without deciding, and then she had looked at it for a moment and decided that there was a kind of honesty in arriving as the same person she had been on the first night, no more dressed for performance, no less. She was placed at the head of the presentation in the war room, which Cale had arranged without discussing it with her directly. He had simply made the seating assignment, which Harwick had conveyed to her with the particular careful neutrality of someone conveying an arrangement they find entirely appropriate. She presented the analysis to 7 Pack Council representatives and a room full of advisors and generals, and she was thorough and she was exact and she was completely herself. The border pack person who had lived in the territory, who knew what the documents said and what they did not say, who was not performing knowledge but simply presenting it. The council representatives asked questions, she answered them. 2 of the 7 were the kind of adversarial that comes from a position under pressure. They challenged sourcing, questioned methodology, pressed on conclusions. She held her ground without aggression, answered with specificity, and was, by the end of the second hour, presenting with the confidence of someone who has prepared for an argument and found it exactly where they expected. At the end of the presentation, the lead delegate, a heavy-set man named Aldous Carr, with the manner of someone who has held difficult political positions for many years and is tired of it, said, "The informal network documentation. This is original research." "Yes," she said. "Sourced from personal observation and border family correspondence." "Primarily, yes, cross-referenced with the Palace Archives pre-agreement records." He looked at her for a moment. "Miss Aldenmore, the Delvane operation targeted you because this work identified vulnerabilities in a structure that had been very profitable to certain parties." He paused. "I want to say formally and for the record that the operation was an error in judgment and that the Council has taken internal action. And I want to say informally and not for the record that the analysis you have produced is the most complete picture of the Eastern Network that any policy body has had since the agreements were made." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you." He nodded. He looked at Cale, who was at the head of the war room with the composure that was simply a wall now. "You have an unusual advisor," he said. "Yes," Cale said. "I do." The formal dinner was full and warm, and the kitchen had surpassed itself on the occasion of a council delegation, which the kitchen always did because competition was one of the oldest human motivations. She sat to Cale's left. 6 weeks she had been sitting in that chair, and it had not stopped being significant. She did not think it would stop being significant. She thought that might be the point, that some things are significant not once but continuously, in the way that the old pine trees are significant not when you plant them, but every morning you go to them. He was in conversation with Aldous Carr on his right for most of the first course. She attended to the people around her, a council advisor she had not met, Frederick Wren, Helena Cole across the table, who caught her eye once and did what she did when she was genuinely pleased about something, rearranged the position of her salt dish. During the second course, Cale turned to her. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the table in the way that meant he was deciding how to say something, and she gave him the time, the way she always gave him time when the thing he was working toward was worth it. "Carr was right," he said. "The presentation was the most complete picture anyone has assembled." "The data was available," she said. "It just needed someone who knew where to look." Not only that, he looked at her. It needed someone who understood what it meant. She held his gaze 2 seconds more. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the ward arrangement." She waited. It was a 6-month term originally, by convention. He was careful in his language in the way he was always careful, precise, choosing each word for what it actually held. "I am not raising this because I want you to leave. I am raising it because I want to know what you want." She looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the East Wing room with its east-facing window. She thought about the back corner of the library and the Wednesday dining room and the garden and the armory and the study with its north-facing window, and the view she had learned was chosen for the view. "I want to finish what I started," she said. "The Eastern framework is incomplete without a full implementation review. That is another 6 months minimum." "Yes," he said. "And I would want to be present for the council follow-up. The informal network analysis is a living document. It needs someone who understands its methodology to keep it current. Yes, he said again. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full, open attention she had come to know in the weeks since the garden, the attention that did not manage her but simply received her. "And I want to stay," she said, "for those reasons and for other reasons." He was quiet for a moment. "The chair to my left," he said. "That is something that does not change with the term of a ward arrangement." She understood exactly what he was saying. She held it in the careful way she held things that were significant, and she said, "I know." He turned back to the table. The dinner continued. The council delegates were discussing trade terms with the advisors down the table. Frederick Wren was taking careful notes. Helena Cole was, from across the table, doing an admirable job of appearing to attend entirely to the person she was seated next to. Under the table, where the formal white cloth fell in its perfectly pressed folds, Cale's hand moved and rested on the tablecloth between them. She put her hand next to his, not on top, next to. Their fingers not overlapping, just side by side, close enough to feel the warmth. They remained like this through the rest of the first course and into the second. Nobody saw. Or perhaps Helena Cole saw, because Helena Cole saw most things, and the salt dish moved very slightly to the left again, but in a different direction this time, which Lyra suspected was its own language and did not try to translate. The days that followed did not announce themselves as significant. This was what she had come to understand about the things that matter most. They do not arrive with ceremonial weight. They arrive as Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, as briefings and analysis and cold mornings in the garden and margin notes going back and forth, and all of it is the significant thing, continuously, in the way the pine trees are continuously there. She stopped counting weeks. The court adapted. It adapted the way courts adapt, not by being told to, but by observing, filing, recalibrating. The space to Cale's left became her space in the casual shorthand of the household. Her documents went directly to the war room copy when they needed the war room, not through a chain of intermediaries. General Cole stopped prefacing his questions to her with Miss Aldenmore and shortened it, in the efficient way of soldiers, to just Aldenmore, which was how he addressed the advisors he trusted. She wrote to her father, a long letter, longer than the previous ones, honest in the places she had been careful about before. She told him about the Pack Council presentation and the Delvane resolution and the informal network analysis and its reception. She told him that the Eastern framework was going to be substantially improved in the next review, and that she expected to be involved in that review, and that she expected to be at Ironville for the foreseeable future. She told him, "I have found my territory, not in the way of land, in the way of purpose." Her father wrote back in his usual fashion, 2 pages, direct, clear, with the dry humor of a man who had governed a border territory for 30 years, and had long since stopped performing anything for anyone's benefit. He wrote, "I hoped it would be good for you. I did not dare hope it would be this good. Then your mother sends her love. The Eastern Road is better maintained than it was. Someone down there is doing good work." She laughed, a real laugh, quick and private, in the east wing room with the morning coming through the east window. She folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer and went to the garden. The winter was giving way. It was slow, the mountains held their snow for a long time, but in the garden the frost was lighter now, and where the sun hit the south wall it was possible, in the middle of the day, to stand without feeling the cold as an insult. She went to the old pines. She put her hand on the bark of the largest one and stood there, not grounding herself this time. She did not need it in that way anymore, but simply being present with a thing that had been present for a very long time, longer than the palace, longer than the path, longer than the complicated and specific business of people learning to trust each other. She heard his steps. He came around the curve of the path and stopped, the way he always stopped, and looked at her, the way he always looked at her, and she looked back. "The council confirmation came this morning," he said. "The framework review is approved. It will begin in the spring." "Good." He moved to stand beside her, near the large pine. She could feel the beast alongside him, warm, present, easy in a way it had not been easy in a very long time. Easy the way a river is easy when it is running in the channel it was meant for. "Lyra," he said. "Yes." He looked at the tree. He was in the process of saying something. She could feel him building toward it with the care he brought to things that mattered, finding the right language for the right weight. She waited. In the spring, he said, I would like to show you the northern ranges. She looked at him. The ones visible from your study window. Yes. She thought about a man who had chosen a window for its view rather than its light, and who went to a study when he needed somewhere of his own, and who had planted pine trees in the month he lost something enormous, and had stood among them every morning for 6 years. I would like that, she said. He turned toward the path. She turned with him, and they walked back toward the palace through the morning that was beginning to have more warmth in it than cold, in the careful incremental way of things that are changing in a direction they mean to go. At the palace entrance, where the kitchen smell was coming up from below and the household was moving through its morning and the lamps were still burning against the gray, he paused. She paused with him. You set it free, he said. He said it simply not as a declaration but as something he was stating for the record, in the way of someone who has reached a conclusion through careful thought and is now noting it aloud. I did not know it was possible. I had stopped believing it was. She looked at him. It was always possible, she said. It was waiting for the right moment. Yes, his eyes were steady. It was waiting for you. She held this. Then come to breakfast, she said. Frederick has the morning schedule and it is going to be complicated and you should eat first. He almost smiled, the full version, the one she had been seeing more often, the one that reached the rest of his face. Practical, he said. Always, she said. They went inside and the palace moved around them with its morning efficiency, and the old pine trees stood in the garden as they had always stood, and the sky above Ironville was doing the slow, certain thing that it always did, moving toward the day, indifferent to how long it takes anyone to be ready for it, patient enough to wait.